The wind came in low over the basin, a whisper that carried dust and the faintest scent of creosote and rain that never quite arrived. Tyann walked with her head bowed against it, one arm curved around the warm, drowsy weight of her son, the other gripping the fraying strap of the buckskin bundle at her shoulder. The prairie light cut across everything at an angle, turning the yucca blades to silver knives and her shadow into a long, thin spear cast ahead of her. She did not look back. Looking back invited the past to follow like a starving coyote. Her ribs ached where the fall from the ravine had left a crescent of purple swelling beneath her doeskin. Her bare feet were stiff with grit, the soles alive with 1,000 pinpricks. Where the land had tested her and for now not found her wanting. She kept to the fence line because men loved to lay straight fences in a world that fought the notion of straightness, and where men made lines, they made water, windmills, troughs, a damp cool-down in the ribs of the earth where the cattle came, and drank and forgot they were being fattened for death. Nalin slept against her collarbone, breath small and even, his lashes catching dust and still. He'd been inconsolable when the moon was high, crying for the father who would never answer, for the old mother who had slipped into the dark seasons before him, for a hunger that was more than the belly knows. She had hummed until her throat went raw. The tune was not a prayer, not exactly. It was a thread she could pull taut and follow when the world's edges blurred. It was a promise she made to every version of herself that had already fallen and gotten up again. Crows hovered above the windmill ahead, raglings of black punctuation on the sentence of sky. She slowed without deciding to, every muscle listening. There were voices under the wind, the kind that wore boots and made words break at the edges. Tyann crouched and pressed her palm to Nalin's hair, lifting a strand to feel its smooth stubbornness between finger and thumb. Her hand shook once, like a leaf finding the limit of its branch. The fence rattled, just a shift of wire catching. Son. It wasn't enough to run. She had learned the truth of running. If you run carrying a child, you carry speed like fire, and it eats the air first and then you. So she straightened, set her mouth in a line, and walked toward the windmill like a woman coming home from a long morning of chores, like a woman who belonged to the sight of a yard and a pump handle and a patched shirt snapping on the line. Man stepped from the shadow of the tank. He was not much older than she was, but age wore different clothing on his body. He held himself like someone who had once been wider and taller and had, in the past 2 years, unbuckled those illusions and hung them neatly in a closet. His shirt was stitches and sun. His hat was a softer brown than his hair, and his face had the look of a rock on the north side of a mesa. Used to wind, not much given to talking, water first, he said, in a voice that sounded like a low flute played from a cave mouth. He moved as if from far away, deliberate, palms out. The pump handle squealed, the water rose, cold and iron bright, and filled the tin cup he had hung on a nail. Tyann did not take the cup. She lowered Nalin into the curve of the trough, holding his weight until she felt the water accept him, then scooped and let a thin stream be an ocean for his mouth. He made small sounds. Relief flowed into the spaces between her bones, as if the world itself were thawing. The man did not move closer. Dust slid off the brim of his hat, one grain at a time in the lifting wind. "Ride?" he asked, which was a kindness. He was giving her a chance to avoid saying the truth. She answered with the truth anyway. "No," she said. Her English was a trail widened by use, smoothed by people who had walked it together so long they knew where each other's feet would land, but it still had stones in it, syllables that caught and shifted. "Walk." He nodded once, as if her answer made a pattern appear that had been there all along. "You're on my land," he said, and his mouth twitched, trying to be humor, trying to make the words softer. "But the land isn't good at belonging. Behind him, the yard unfolded in the way yards do when someone lives there with intention, scrub pulled, tools leaned in careful hierarchies against the side of a barn, a dog that watched her with one ear up like a question mark, fence posts that weren't new wood but had new nails hammered into them at equal distances. She saw the evidence of a pair of hands everywhere, which meant there were fewer hands than she would like in a house, which meant this man did not have a wife. The absence of a wife was a little wind that moved her hair where it hung down the back of her neck. "Rancher," she said, not a question. "Rowan Pike," he answered, as if the name might be useful as a tool or a doorway. Then he added a sentence that sounded like a prayer and like a warning at once. "You're safe here." Safe was a word that meant nothing and everything, and sometimes both at once. Tyann drank now, swallowing small, timed with her breathing. When the cup was light, she set it in the trough and pushed back her hair, the long braid heavy with dust. For a moment, the weight of her own scalp felt like a hand pressing her into the earth. "My son," she said. "My son and I will sit. Then we will go." Rowan's eyes flicked over her shoulder at the basin, the road that wasn't, the line of mesquite where the night liked to keep its last minutes. He knew what she meant by going. He knew also that she would not get very far. You can tell this by the way a man's chest lifts to speak and then stops because the words will make the air worse. He set the pump handle down. The squeal of the hinge was already disappearing into the wind. "You can sit in my shade," he said. "You can sit in my kitchen." Tyann weighed the sentence. She had not slept more than the thickness of a leaf since the ravine, and that sleep had been full of falling. She had the medicinal bark she chewed when she needed to make her body keep going without consent, but the taste of it had grown into the taste of grief, and she could not put it in her mouth without swallowing her dead husband a second time. She wanted a wall to lean on. She wanted a worry to set down for a minute and pick up again like a bundle that had places molded into it where her fingers had lived for years. Still, kitchen. Still, man. Still, the white clay world of a house, where chairs made beating the earth unnecessary. The deerskin on her back prickled with memory of too many rooms where a woman who was not her had claimed air like a property. She did not move. Rowan didn't ask again. He crouched near the trough as far from her as the fence would let him. Bian sat in the dust, shoulders against the wood. "Your dog will tell me if someone comes," she said. "My husband died 3 moons ago," she said, and took the breath that comes after you grip something bleeding by the handle and lift it. Not by bullet. Sickness that did not want to tell us its name. He said the name would give it power. And I said the name would let us know what it was, and he said both things were true, and so we said no name, and watched him go. The headman asked for me then, because he knew I can carry what other women should not have to. I carried the brush for the body fire. I carried a calm face when the mothers were not done crying. I carried this." She laid a palm on the little cylinder without quite touching it. "From our people to a band that travels north this season, there are men in uniforms who have learned to read certain rapping, so we rap differently now. They might stop me, they might not. If they did, I would say this is a prayer object. It is. And it is also instruction, and it is also a promise." Rowan lifted his mug and drank without tasting. He looked at her like she was speaking, but also like he was reading the shape of the breath behind her words. "If soldiers stop you," he said, so quietly the dog raised his head to listen, "then my yard will be their yard. I don't like what happens when men who don't love a place decide to look under its rocks." "They already looked under so many," Tyann murmured. "Some rocks learned to grow legs and walk away when they saw bluecoats." The thin smile that came to bother her mouth did not last. "My aunt said to go before the moon was round again, to hurry. But Nalin had a cough we did not like, and I will not put that cough on the back of a horse for many days. I walked slower than the men thought I would. If I had my husband's feet to teach me again, I would walk different. She touched the crescent at her ribs. The land chose to teach me instead. His glance flicked to the bandage and back, to her face. You'll let me put that right? Tyen held still and measured. He would not force his medicine on her. He was making an offer the way people set water for birds no one will ever see drink. You may look, she said. The words were small but not mean. No touching without asking. He dipped his chin in a gratitude that came from his spine, not his mouth. He got the doctor's kit. The cities loved to sell such kits to men who lived where doctors pretended they did not, and knelt, which made the dog shift aside with a sigh. His fingers were careful even when they were 3 inches away. He cut the lacing at the side seam without cutting the skin underneath, and unrolled clean linen with an economy that spoke of practice. When he slid the old wrap free, the purple trembled at the edge of her breath. He waited for her to steady it, then he bound her. His hands smelled like saddle soap and juniper, and the sort of sweat that lives in work, not in worry. Nalin patted the dog's head like kneading bread, and told the dog very serious things, in a mixture of words the dog definitely understood, and words the dog decided to invent definitions for on the spot. Rowan's mouth twitched. It was a better smile than before. It didn't feel like something he had to dredge from somewhere deep. Men will come, Tyen said, when the linen had settled, and the new pain had replaced the old pain with the temporary relief of order made from chaos. Maybe not with the sun today, maybe with the next sun. They will not knock. They will have the kind of faces that believe knocking is a weakness. Blue? Rowan asked. Some, she said. Some not. Some with the look of men who think every woman is a saddle between battles. Some with the look of boys who grew. A man's voice too fast and want to prove they can carry it. Sometimes those are the worst. And, she added, and here her voice changed in a way the room felt and sat up for, some not men you know. The cards on the table flipped themselves in the air and landed as if they were the same cards, and it took a second before anyone noticed the pictures were different. Rowan lifted his head. Not soldiers. No, Tyen said. Rowan Pike. I'm not alone in the world. None of us are. But I am very much not alone. She slid the wrapped cylinder back into the bundle. If you were any other kind of man, I would not have come close to your fence. But if you were any other kind of man, this would be a different story. And stories know when they want to live. He was a careful thinker. She could see the carefulness settling around his eyes like commiserating crows. He tried to pick up only the piece she had set down for him. He respected the shape of what people kept. If you are not alone and you came to my yard, he said, weighing each word to see if it felt like an accusation in his mouth and filing it smooth when it did, then others will come to my yard. People who hold you carefully will come to see if I held you that way. She put her hands around her cup in the manner of someone who has carried water from many kinds of places and learned to make it an altar. Yes, she said simply, that is what happens when a woman sleeps beneath a roof that is not her people's roof. The people become the roof. They will fit themselves around her. They will listen to the wind that went through her hair and smell her on the dust and measure the prints in the yard and learn the weight of the word safe in her mouth. They will come quiet so the land can keep sleeping. They will let the dogs think nothing is wrong until the exact moment they decide to be seen. Rowan's laugh was short and dry and not unkind. I'll tell Buck he can take the morning off, from pretending to know everything. The dog wagged once, as if to acknowledge slander and let it pass. Rowan set the kit away and closed the latch so it clicked against itself. I appreciate being warned. It is not a warning, Tyen said. It is a courtesy, and a way to say, choose how to carry yourself now. Men who come with questions sometimes do not listen to answers unless the man they are asking has decided who he is ahead of time. He stood and positioned his knees under Nalin's chair, as if the boy's weight mattered already to the chair. And to gravity both. I don't own more than this yard, this land, and the words I say to the people who walk on it. He said it as if it was plenty. He said it as if it was more than a man could hold without strain, and he set his shoulders. Anyway, you can sleep on my bed. I'll string a hammock in the room off the lean-to. The wind goes through that door like it pays a toll. I will sleep sitting, Tyann said. Sleep doesn't know me when I lie down. It would try to make me become someone I was, and I cannot be her again. She lifted Narlin. He was heavy with beans and relief. He settled onto her thigh with a grunt that managed to be a thank you. You sleep, she told Rowan, because it was the kind of language that refuses to be one way. There will be eyes in the night that watch, and they will see a man who trusts the roof he made. That is louder than a gun. He could have argued that last point. He had at least 3 guns in that house that she could have listed by weight. And smell, and the scuffs on their wood. He did not argue. If men with blue coats come, he said instead, eyes on the window, I will speak with my mouth before I speak with anything else. They will not like it. The sheriff in town owes me not money, a truth. He can come and deliver it for once. My people will not come when they come, Tyann said. 2 storms do not meet unless they plan it. There is a rule for everything, even anger, even love. He nodded again, as if he had his own rules that were old and hard, and ran like a creek under his yard that only he knew to drink from. Then he did something that made the room's bones shift with attention. He reached up to the lintel and pulled down a small horseshoe that had been nailed there, an iron that had tasted 100 steps and been heated, cooled, heated again before. It learned to be a symbol of luck. He set it on the table between them. You'll leave this when you go, he said, not because I need luck, because I want something to remind me that I am not the only person who decides what kind of story my roof tells. She looked at the iron until the oven heat inside her softened. I will leave it, she said, and because the world insists. On balance, she added, and I will take something of yours, not to keep, to carry to the people who will want to know what kind of man you are. He reached for the calico scrap and stopped, knowing it was too light. He looked at the jar of nails and stopped, knowing they were too heavy with other people's work. His eyes landed on the jar of dried beans, and he lifted 4 and put them in her palm. Tell them I feed what I can, he said. And even if it sounded like a joke, it wasn't one. The beans were smooth as decisions made at the right time. She wrapped them in a twist of the little brown paper that the doctor's kit had come with, and tied the paper with a hair from her own braid dot. They watched the day move over the yard, how the light changed the meaning of the same shapes. Sometimes the trough was a small river, sometimes it was a mirror, sometimes it was a mouth that had learned to drink. The dog made a map of the same 6 smells and rewrote it every hour and was pleased every time. Tyann shifted and stretched her ankle and sent a voice into the place behind her breastbone where her dead lived. Watch me rest for a little while. This is also battle. Watch me drink in this man's kitchen and do not judge me. The voice that answered her sounded very much like the old women and very much like her own, which is what happens when you listen long enough to people who love you. It said, eat. It said, sleep. It said, wake when the land tells you to wake. Rowan made himself a hammock out of a canvas tarp and some rope, in a way that said he had watched traveling men do this 300 times and thought, one day I will need this nonsense. And that day kept moving away because he had a proper bed until now. He hung it between 2 beams in the lean-to, where the door that led to nowhere but a small square of shade gave the wind a run at his feet. He lay down in it while the sun was still young enough to be smug. He was asleep in 5 breaths, which is the privilege of men who know the work will be the same when they open their eyes again. Tyann did not sleep. She did what her mother had taught her on long nights when the coyotes cried for the way the moon sometimes forgot its own face. She softened every muscle without letting go of the bone. She pulled her mind into a shape like a blanket that had been folded neatly and set on a cedar chest. She watched the line of light under the door, the dust that rose and fell in it. When Nalin made the sound that meant a dream had asked him if he wanted to follow it, she answered for him with a sound that meant, "No, thank you." He turned, his face into the fold of her dress, and the dream fled the way small birds fly out of the path of cattle. The first visitor was not a man. It was the quiet that arrives right before someone who is very good at moving without your permission moves. The dog's ear made a new shape. The dog did not get up. Tyann bent her head as if fixing her sandal and let her eyes go to the side. Her figure crossed the yard and went into the shade under the oak, whose roots had chosen to take the house's water and pay for it by living with children's hands on its bark every day. The figure was a shadow wearing a second shadow as a shirt. The shadow did not speak. Tyann did not speak. The yard breathed. Rowan slept. Nalin dreamed of something with hooves and joy. After a long time, a small mark appeared on the dust between the oak and the water trough, a line broken in the middle as if a stick had said, "I was here," and then left. She exhaled once, a tiny release. The mark wasn't for her, it was for the land. It told the land that it had been seen just so, and that just so was acceptable today. While the sun worked, Tyann cleaned Rowan's kitchen the way women do when they are not being watched by men, and so do not have to pretend the work is small. A good kitchen makes a sound when it is cared for. It is like hearing the strings of a bow being warmed by the hands of a player. She washed the cup with the hairline crack as if it were a child's forehead. She shook the rug and felt the dust loosen and go back to the earth to tell its stories there. When she reached for the broom, Rowan's voice came from the lean-to, drowsy with sleep and apology. "You don't?" "I do," she said, without him having to finish. The room asked. He watched her for a minute, as if the act of watching a woman sweep her way the way she meant to was a picture he wanted to hang in his head where the worst pictures couldn't touch it. Then he set a pot to boil again, because men like Rowan Pike make beans the way some people make prayers. In the late afternoon, a wagon's shape scratched the horizon. The dog went from question mark to exclamation point and then back to question. Rowan washed his hands and wiped them on his shirt and said, "Sheriff." He did not say it like a curse. He did not say it like a blessing. He said it like a word that came with other words that would have to be balanced. The sheriff wore his badge like a token, recruited into service. It did not shine. He was the kind of man whose moustache spoke ahead of him, but his eyes tried very hard to be the speaker of his house. He got down from the wagon and patted the horse that had carried his worries out here. The deputy who had come with him had the look of someone who had set out to be mean and had only managed to be tired. "Afternoon," the sheriff said. "Rowan." He glanced at Tyann and, to his credit, did not put the word "well" or "now" at the front of his mouth. He shifted his weight. "Ma'am." Tyann looked at his hand, where it rested near the buckle of his belt, and then at his hat brim, and then at the places where the sun had burned the line of his collar into his neck. She could smell the boy he had been, and the man he had tried to teach that boy into. She put her hand on Nalin's back. He was making a road for a beetle with 2 bits of biscuit. "You have news," Rowan said, and there was no accusation in it. "Or you wouldn't be here with a man who doesn't like to leave iron on the table where someone else can pick it up." The sheriff smiled without teeth. "Been some trouble down near the river," he said. "A rancher named Holt says he found 2 cows with their throats cut and a brand sliced. He's making noise like you hear in a saloon right before chairs start flying. He thinks he knows whose knife did it." His eyes went to Tyann and then back to Rowan so quickly that any less attentive woman would have missed it. "And do you know?" Rowan asked. The sheriff's mouth flattened. "I know he's the kind of man who likes to pick a shape and then find the story that will fit into it. If I tell him he's wrong, he'll decide I'm not doing my job. If I tell him he's right, he'll decide his fists are the law until I correct him. Either way, I don't sleep. Men like Holt think lack of sleep makes them holy and makes them brave. Me, it makes me stupid." He looked at Nalin, and without looking exactly at the cut, on Tyen's side, put the bad math together and was ashamed of having tried. "I wanted to see with my own eyes who was in your yard." "Eyes can lie," Tyen said calmly, "but they make a different lie than ears." The deputy cleared his throat. "We heard soldiers were out," he said, and his voice suggested that he had never yet gotten used to that fact and might die without it ever feeling like a thing that belonged to the air. "Caught 2 boys on the state road. Boys said there was a woman with a child headed east. Bluecoats don't like women who walk and don't ask permission. You know how it is." He said it to Rowan and also to himself, as if he'd been addressed. Lately, by a part of his soul he didn't keep a hat for. "I know how it is," Rowan said after a time, "and I know I don't like it. You'll have coffee." They drank the coffee that tasted like a fist, and the sheriff made a face that was honest, and saved him from making a worse one later when someone's lies might ask him to change it. "You always make it like this?" he asked, wiping his mustache. "With the back of his wrist, because men like him don't like to use their sleeve unless they're trying to show the world they remember being a boy." "Sometimes it's stronger," Rowan said. Dot. The sheriff's eyes slid to Tyen again. "Ma'am," he said, and the word was an admission, "I don't know what Holt will do. I don't know what soldiers will do. I know what I'll do. I'll do my job. But sometimes that's not the same thing as being good." His mouth tilted. "Being good makes men in town put a lock on your door. Doing your job means they bring you pies and tell you their wives think your mother did a fine job and that you should come by for supper because there's no sense going hungry on account of principles. I like pie." "Pie can be a principle," Tyen said, "if you eat it right." She felt Rowan look at her, surprised into a breath of laughter he swallowed so it would not become a sound. The dog's tail tapped once like a small hammer, finding the nails. Head Dot, they left with their cups empty and the sun heavier on their shoulders. Rowan watched the wagon out to the turn at the cottonwood, then came back to where Tyen had set her fingers on the place between Nalin's shoulders that kept him from casting his whole self into the Beetle's road and never returning. "You are thinking of not liking me if bad men come here for me," Tyen said before he could speak. "It would be easier to not like me. Then you could make a sound in your throat and pretend it is the sound of a man doing what he must." "I was thinking of what kind of pie the sheriff likes," Rowan said too quickly. Then more carefully he added, "And I was thinking about chairs and how men in saloons throw them when they cannot think of how to pick up the words they set down wrong." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "If a man comes here thinking you are his problem to solve, I know what I will say. I won't say it into the wind. I won't say it to your back. I'll say it to his face, and then I'll brace my feet and try not to turn into the kind of person I promised my mother I wouldn't become." "Your mother," Tyen repeated, and the word did the kind of work old words do when they cross languages. They stand there kindly and let both tongues see themselves in each other's mirror. "She's alive. She's the reason my hands looked like this," he said, holding them up in a way that involved pride and complaint and devotion. "She told me that every living thing needs one man who says, 'I'll stand here with you,' until someone else learns to stand here too." She didn't Simon. Exactly. She said person. But I was a boy and thought she was cheering me alone. He shrugged. She wasn't. She was cheering herself. She always did like to trick me into being decent. "Tricks can teach," Tyen said. She stood, and the room observed it. "I will make a stack of wood by the door that leads to the room where the wind pays its toll. Wood says I am not leaving yet. It also says if I must, I will take fire with me. That is a sentence your sheriff will feel under his feet." He didn't ask her to do it. He didn't tell her he would do it and turn it into a favor. He said, "Thank you. Like a man who had been given a skill and intended to earn it, Evening did what it does in a basin like theirs. It brought a purple manufactured by distance and the smell of something blooming where no bloom could survive if it had to live anywhere else. Rowan lit a lamp and turned its wick until it remembered it was a tame fire. Tyan gathered Narlin, who had the gift. Children have for pouring themselves into sleep like water through a narrow place in rock. She made a place for him that was made of her and of a blanket, and of the certainty that this one night anyway, no one would take him. Rowan said good night the way a man says it, when he is careful not to borrow or lend anything when he speaks. The hammock took him up. The rope made a music that sang to the old beams about how they had not been wasted. The dog lay himself across the threshold, like the joint that keeps a door honest. Tyan did not sleep. She crossed into that other room beside sleep, where the body rests and the eyes learn to hear. She sat with her back against the door and felt the house in her bones. Houses like this remember the men who built them. They remember the boys those men were. They remember women's laughter when women have lived there, and they remember the exact outline of silence when they have not. Tyan felt the silence and knew it wasn't lonely. It had learned to look out the windows and not turn into hunger. Sometime between 1 and 2 fires of the night. She had never liked numbers so much as the old time told in measures of wood. Something changed. The wind did not die. It turned a corner. The dog did not growl. He opened his eyes very wide and then shut them as if to say, I am part of this room and the room knows what it is doing. The dust in the beam of light under the door stopped traveling in a straight line and began to rise and fall like breath. You could see Narlin stirred. Tyan leaned and kissed his hair, and the taste of dust and beans and her own skin met and decided. They belonged together for the moment. The house breathed with her. Outside, the oak said nothing the way trees say nothing when they are telling you everything. A soft scrape, like a hand over stone, came from the yard, and then another. The hair on Tyen's forearms did not stand. It lay down flatter as if the air had smoothed it. She pressed her palm to the floor and felt the hum a land makes when the feet on it keep time with the song it sings for itself. She stood and let her braid fall behind her spine like a river. She unlatched the door and opened it with the respect people reserve for elders and for tools that know how to cut. The night was a bowl. The moon had spilled but caught herself on the edge. The stars were pinned there like beadwork that had once decorated a woman's skirt and now had learned to belong to Sky. They were there. First, she saw the edges, the suggestion of horse shoulder, a glint that might be metal or might be the eye of a man who had not closed his in 2 days, the outline of a feather braid where it touched the shoulder of a woman who wore it like a memory instead of a costume. Then the edges filled in, and the men were men, and the women were women, and the horses were horses, and the night was very much what it had always been. They were not 2. They were not 20. The yard could not count them, because the night had taught them how to be many without being heavy. Their silence was not the silence of mouths held shut by fear or by anger. It was the silence of people who have decided that their words are too valuable to let loose into an air that will cheapen them. It was the silence of people who trust their eyes and their hands and the sound of a horse's breath more than the way English puts a sentence in front of a fact. The nearest horse snorted once, and the dog lifted his head in a motion that said, If I must, I will play my part, but I can see the men who own this quiet, and I belong to a different play tonight. Tyen stepped into the yard, the dust accepting her like a cousin returning from a long trip. A man on a paint horse broke from the line and came forward. He was not old. He wore old well. He looked at her as if they were 2 people who had seen each other in the same dream and were trying not to laugh because they were sure it was a bad time to laugh. Tyen, he said in the language that fit her name, as if her mouth had invented it. The word held her with as much gentleness as a palm on a baby's crown. Do you choose to be where you stand? He had asked it exactly. He had given her the shape a woman needs to walk into a house as herself, and walk out of it that way too. She set her shoulders where her answer would hang true. I choose, she said. I chose the yard, I chose the water, I chose the coffee that fights. She let a breath carry the next words so the air could get used to them before they sat. Down. I chose the man who offered the yard. The horse lifted one front foot and set it down. The sound was a drum softened by leather. A ripple went through the people on horses. No motion, only a change in attention, like the yard had inhaled and then kept the breath just under the edge of its lip. Farther back, a boy shifted. A woman touched the back of his hand, and the shift learned what it was about, and stopped being an argument with his saddle, and started being a way to tell the horse, thank you for being patient with the weight of a boy trying to learn to be one thing and a man trying to learn another. Your son? The rider asked. Sleeping, Tyann said. She let her voice go low so the house could hold the sound before the night got greedy. She rested her palm on her belly a little and then let it hang loose. He did hard work all day for a boy. He carried a nap like a mule carries a canteen. He will do hard work again tomorrow. Let him sleep. The man's mouth did a thing like it wanted to be amused and didn't want to be disrespectful. He looked at the door and then at the lintel above it. He saw the space where the horseshoe had been. He saw the shadow it had left behind and the way the shadow had learned to be decorative. He glanced over her shoulder, and the glance took in the stacked wood and catalogued it among 100 other true things. The way the broom leaned, the way the dog trusted his bed to stay the shape of his body while he solved this other problem. This man, he said. He did not give Rowan a name he hadn't earned yet. Does he carry his mouth well? He carries his mouth like a bucket, Tyann said. He does not have holes where he does not expect them. She let the humor of that be the kind that helps people remember a day, and not the kind that makes them small. Holt, the man said, and put anger into the name without putting anger into his face. Holt is how water rots wood. He is all standing and no moving. He's the kind of straight that turns a tree into a ladder and then blames the man who climbs it for falling. I saw the sheriff, Tyann said. His mouth was full of pie. And principle. I think he knows how to put both on a plate without making them fight. The man nodded. We will not wear out his plate if we can help it. He looked past her into the house. The man. Does he have women? No women, Tyann said, and she made the words exactly what they were, and not more. She kept her voice steady and her breath behind it, so that no one listening from far away could add spices that weren't in the stew. He has a mother in the way that men who make good roofs always have mothers, living or not. He has a dog who hears better than some church deacons. He has sleeping that trusts him. He has beans. The man's laugh was real and went around the yard and came back like a bird that knows where its nest lives. Several men behind him shifted on their horses to make room for that sound to sit beside them. Someone farther back made a small whistle and got a look that said, Not yet. You brought me a question, the rider said, coming closer. He was near enough now that Tyann could see the old scar at his jaw, fine as a hair, the kind that a boy gets when a branch decides to remind him to be less in love with speed. That is why you are standing and not already on a horse riding away. He leaned, and the leather creaked the way leather does when it has been patient with a lot of weather. Do we fight with the man's enemies, or do we teach him to endure the day as if he were one of ours? Tyann looked at his hands. They were calling out in ways that told you whether a man carried rope more than reins. He had the marks of someone who tied up his own wounds and then untied them to check the healing, and then tied them again because men are proud, and because pride keeps men alive, at least as often as it kills them. We do neither, she said, softly, and the yard stilled to hear a soft thing placed like a knife exactly where it needed to go. We find out how he is about being looked at. A murmur went through the line, not approval, not dissent. curiosity, respect, maybe. A boy's voice said, "He is being looked at," and got an answer in a woman's glance that stuck the words to the inside of his teeth until they softened. Rowan stepped into the doorway. Then, not because men were in his yard, but because Tayen had left the door open, and a good man knows you do not let the night assume it may take your whole house into itself. He did not carry a gun in his hands. He did not carry his mouth half open like men do when they are making a speech they haven't thought through and want a syllable to fill the part where their courage hasn't arrived yet. He had his hands at his sides, empty palms where the rope burns told their truth. He took in the horses. He took in the men. He took in the way the horses were thinking their own thoughts and the way the men let them. He did not count. He did not make "how many" into a panic. He stood where the lamp made his shadow a second man that understood this yard better than he ever would. "Evening," he said, and the word extended itself like a bridge between the door and the world. "Do you need water?" The man on the paint horse nodded once. "We need to know whether the woman in your kitchen was the kind of safe that robs a woman of a self, or the kind of safe that puts more self back into her." Rowan lifted his chin. He did not look at Tayen because he knew he was not part of her answer. He was only part of his own. "She decided where to sit," he said. "She decided what to do with my broom. She decided how to make my coffee less like a fist and more like a handshake. I tried to decide how to be the kind of man my mother wanted at her table, and failed some and succeeded some, the way men do who have not had enough sleep. She slept how she sleeps, and I put a rope and a tarp where a bed should be, and did not ask the wind to treat me soft, because I have learned the wind only hears its own long stories." There was a silence in which people heard what they needed to in those words. Tayen felt 3 different versions of the same truth settle in 3 different sets of shoulders. She felt the yard put one more small stone under its own foot to be more level than it had been when morning woke it. "You will be looked at," the rider said to Rowan, "by men who do not look and by men who like to look and tell the world what they did see and what they did not. Do you know how to keep your mouth when men like that take an interest in it?" Rowan's smile now was the kind you make for yourself in a mirror when you need to remember you have more than one kind. "I planned to put pie in it," he said. Ripple of laughter, skirting the edge of being too much, and then backing away from that edge, the way a horse backs from a hole. You know is a hole even when the grass over it has learned the trick of looking solid, ran around the wide circle. Someone spoke in a voice that had not forgotten to be young. "He is ready for the sheriff's kitchen, then." The rider turned his head. "Holt will come," he said. "He is the kind of nail that thinks wood loves being split. He will come, with men and with stories. He will tell the soldiers he knows where a woman is who needs to be taught a different way to walk or punished for using the way she has. We will be closer than he thinks we are. Close like a shirt is close to a shoulder." Rowan's jaw tightened enough you could hang a bucket on it. "If he comes to my door," he said, "I will answer it. If he pounds my door," he looked up at the lintel where the horseshoe's shadow had decided to live, "I will take the door off its hinges, and we will talk outside where my mother taught me language is harder to lie with." Tayen stepped, so that the brim of Rowan's hat and the shadow under the rider's jaw made a line that crossed above her heart. She said quietly, "He will not lie to you. He will lie to himself. Those lies are harder to cure, but they are not impossible." She looked at the faces, the brows under the feathers, and the hair that had learned to lie smooth in wind because the person it grew from refused to be shifted by gusts that did not bring rain. "If I ask you to wait until morning to do whatever it is you mean to, will you wait?" The rider looked at the stars as if a boy he had been once had scratched a note into a table up there, and he was checking that it had not faded. He nodded. "We will wait. We will look and we will listen. And at dawn," he turned his horse so that the iron in its shoes set 4 words on the ground, "we will be seen." They moved then, the whole circle, not like a circle breaking, but like a circle becoming larger, like a heart teaching itself how to make room for more blood, because it has decided more life is coming and it had better prepare. They poured into the mesquite, and became not men on horses, but the line you see on a distant ridge when the sun tells you stories about mussels and skydot. Tyen shut the door very gently. The dog thunked his tail once, and then settled. Rowan let out a breath that had been standing near his collarbone, waiting for permission. He looked at her and said, without moving his mouth much, 200. At least, Tyen said, and a bit of giddiness ran through her like a colt that had been tied too long and was finally allowed to buck once in the yard. But they will drink like 20. They were raised to know the difference between thirst and wanting. Rowan nodded and moved to put more water in the trough anyway, because men like him think maybe thirst has a sense of humor it wants to show off, and the one day you don't put water where you need it is the one day the joke gets old and cruel. The night grew its own spine and held until morning. No blue coats rode up and tried to lay maps over people. No Holt banged his iron mouth on the door. The stars shook free of the west. Morning came on little cat feet like a thief, and then grew bold like a sheriff. The yard put on its day-face dot. The first horse stepped into the open. At the exact moment the sun turned the ridge into a bright bar and lifted it. The second horse stepped into the open. At the exact moment the wind decided the yard could be trusted, with its best smell. Then the third, then the sound of breath, then the sound of leather, then the sound of 200 people not making a sound dot. Rowan stood with his hands at his sides again, which is what you do when a choice is already moving through you, and you can only make room. The dog leaned into his leg. Nalin, wide-eyed, was eating a biscuit as if it were the only biscuit and the most important biscuit. And if this was true, it would still be funny. Tyen's braid touched the middle of her back and said to her spine, "This is not weight, this is belonging." The circle did not close in the way a noose closes. It came around the yard the way women come around a child who has fallen, so that if any danger comes near, the danger will be measured by the thickness of many bodies and many years of knowing how to be angry without breaking the thing you are protecting. The rider on the paint raised his hand. His palm cut the sun, and it bled light on the dust. "Rowan Pike," he said, and used the English like a tool that had learned to be careful when held by someone who did not love it. "We are here. We want to see how you are looked at when all our eyes are on you." Rowan opened his mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. His mother might have been pleased. "You can look," he said. "I will try to be worth the looking." The rider nodded once. The yard waited. The horizon did its job. The day made the light bright enough to count individual hairs on the dog's back. Hoofbeats sounded from beyond the cottonwood. Heavy, rolled out like a drum line. That doesn't care if the drum bears a crack so long as it shouts. Another sound followed. Not leather, not quiet, not careful. Tyen's pulse put its hand on the inside of her throat and pressed, then let go. The riders around them did not shift forward. They did not shift back. They put a little more attention into the way their horses' shoulders moved and into how their knees were. With the daylight, dust rose, like men had shaken a rug out where the basin curves. When the dust had decided it would never again be clean and still settled anyway, men appeared. Not blue, not grey, not law. Men that Holt had collected the way some men collect debts. They had the look of men who had made a small, mean decision, and then made bigger ones to cover the first. Holt himself rode in front. His jaw would have been impressive if it belonged to a different life. His eyes landed on Rowan, and then on Tyen, and then on the riders who had decided to make the yard their skullcap and wear it proudly. His mouth made a joke that it did not share with the world. He lifted his chin like a man who had been told by enough sunlight that he deserved it. "Morning," he called. His voice made the word a word that would never sit comfortably on anyone's lips again if they'd been there to hear it. "Morning," Rowan said, and the way he said it washed Holt's version clean. Holt looked at Tayen as if she were a fence. Id post that had accidentally grown eyes. "That one's mine," he said to the yard and the sky and anyone who wanted to be a witness. "She took a calf. She cut a brand. She stole from me, and I declare here that I am a man who takes back what is mine." The rider on the paint did not move. The 200 around him did not move. The dog did not move. The wind took a moment to think about movement, and then decided standing still was a better song. "No," Tayen said, and the word was not loud. It was the kind of no that had been hardened in a fire and cooled in a river and then used every day for a year to turn earth. "I am not yours." Holt smiled. It wasn't a new smile. It had been used on women and on men who wanted to be applauded by women's eyes, and on boys who had not yet learned that some men's laughs are nets. "That's where you're wrong," he said softly. He looked at Rowan. "You plan to share, I'm sure. But I don't share. I give and I take." He looked at the riders. "You can watch me do either. It will be an education." Rowan's breath did the thing breath does when it wishes it could be a voice already and has not found the path. He set it down where his feet were and where his mother had told him not to leave it. When he spoke, it was to the rider, not to Holt. "Can I ask a question?" The rider on the paint cocked his head a fraction. Rowan nodded at the circle, at the men and women and children in it, at the horses who had decided the yard was good ground, and so had kept their feet still in honor of it. "If I speak now," he said, and his voice had the sort of honesty in it that burrs sticking to pants recognize as a friend, "am I speaking only for myself?" "You always are," the rider said, "but sometimes a man's eye carries a lot of we in it. The trick is not to invite a we that doesn't want to be invited." Rowan nodded again, learned something, took the bridle of it. In his hand, he turned to Holt. "No," he said, and Tayen felt a small weight roll off the day and land somewhere it wouldn't hurt anyone. "No," Rowan said again to the space and the dust, and the second no was the kind you don't have to repeat because it learns to stand by itself. You don't own people, not with English, not with iron, not with stories you tell about brands and calves. You don't own this yard, and you don't own the woman who slept under my roof. You don't own the breath I took this morning, or the pie I plan to put in my sheriff. You own the choices you made and the way they stuck to your hands. I won't help you carry them." Holt laughed then, because some men laugh when they cannot find any other thing to do that will make the world remember their face. 200 of you, he said to the riders, showing his teeth like a man puts knives on a table to make guests fear, and not because he plans to cut bread. 200 to make a point? Don't you tire of being dramatic? The rider on the paint did not answer, because some questions do not deserve to be made into the shape of an answer. He seemed very slightly amused, the way men do when a boy tries a swagger and trips over his own feet at the end of it. "Let's make this easy," Holt said to Rowan. "You walk away. You give me what's mine. They'll follow. There ain't a judge on this basin that'll tell me I can't take care of my own. The law might pretend not to love me, but it knows where its dinner comes from." He tilted his chin again. "Or you can make it hard. There are a lot of hard men with me." Rowan's mouth twitched as if he was going to tell a joke about beans. He didn't. He looked at Tayen finally and said, "Do I speak or do you?" Tayen felt the ground under her feet like a drumhead. She put her heel down where her grandmother had taught her to put it when men gathered and horses breathed and a woman had to tell the wind what it must carry. "I will," she said. She turned to Holt. "I am Tayen. I was always Tayen. Before you were a man who thought mine tasted good inside his mouth, I was Tayen. Before you branded your first calf and learned to brag about it to boys who wanted your way of walking, I was Tayen. I bury my dead with names. I do not cut names into skin. I do not steal what breath made. I carry what breath left. if you want to put your hand on that truth and call it yours." She tilted her head a fraction, and behind her, the 200 did the same thing, so that the yard felt like it had suddenly grown wings. "Your hand will not come back with you." Holt's men shifted. That is an understated way of saying some of them asked themselves how much they enjoyed being part of the stories Holt told about himself, and if those stories had a good ending in them for anyone but Holt. The horses picked up their riders' answers and put them into the placement of their hooves. Holt smiled again because Holt had only 3 tools, and a smile was the only one that worked on days when it wasn't raining. "I'll take my chances," he said, and reached for the rifle that had been standing like a polite guest in its scabbard. The rider on the paint did not move. The 200 did not move. Rowan moved. He moved exactly the way Tien had seen him move around frightened calves and rusty wire and soup that wanted to boil right over and burn the wrist that reached to stop it. He stepped into Holt's imagining and said, very quietly, very clearly, "If you bring a gun to my yard to settle a matter of mouths, you will go home with less man than you brought." Holt's hand hovered. He was not a man who loved hovering. He preferred to call it decide, which is a word that lets men pretend that sometimes a river is a road if you simply walk hard enough on it. The breath of the entire yard held, and then let go in a slow hiss as dust fell off a mesquite pod, somewhere like it had been waiting for this moment to be dramatic. "Choose," Tien said in a voice that was only barely a voice, and also the oldest voice Holt had ever heard. "Choose who you're going to be when you talk about this day in 20 winters, when boys who were not born yet ask you why your eyes are tired." Holt's mouth opened and stayed open stupidly. Then he scowled. Then he made a sound that the men behind him would later say sounded like someone biting into a green persimmon and trying not to spit. He took his hand off the rifle and spread his fingers as if they were proof that he still had a body he could command. "Fine," he said. "Fine. I'll do this with words." He jutted his chin. "Here are my words. Hand the woman over, or I make your life a kind of weather you ain't never lived in." Rowan smiled a little. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't clever. It was the kind of smile that men share at fence lines, when the calf you both rescued stands up and proves that both of you did enough of the right things without any one of you having to be the man who gets the story named after him. "Weather keeps the land honest," he said. "Do your best." The rider on the paint lifted his hand again, not for silence. No one had been trying to speak, but so that the moment would have a place to see itself and be seen. He looked at Tien. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the house and the yard and the dog and the stacked wood and the place where the horseshoe used to make a shadow. Then he turned his horse, and the 200 turned with him, which is the kind of beauty you cannot learn from soldiers and could spend your whole life trying to teach yourself after you've seen it once. They did not leave. They arranged themselves. They became the horizon. They became the phrase that goes before a law and makes the law remember why it was born. Holt swallowed. If a man like that learns to swallow without thinking, it means something else is learning to move in his body, and you will want to watch that thing. He set his jaw. He opened his mouth. And the first dust plume appeared to the south, low and fast, the sort of dust that knows a lot of boots and a lot of iron are on their way and wants to get the hard part over with. Blue. The word did not pass anyone's lips. It rolled across the yard like a coin you regret dropping because you know it will roll exactly into the one crack in the floor you don't know how to fish things out of. The 200 did not move. The sheriff's wagon would not be fast enough to catch this. The deputy's sense wouldn't be strong enough to stand against it. Holt's smile was the kind that makes a boy proud of a father he should be afraid of, and makes a good man ashamed to share the wind with him. Rowan's hand found Tien's without thinking, and then left it alone, because men like Rowan Pike do not take what is not offered, and do not make offerings of women's hands when they are already carrying something too heavy to put down. His chest lifted. The dog leaned. Nalin went very still with a biscuit in his mouth, like a prophecy that forgot how to get out. The blue came on. The riders around them bore the day with their faces. Tyenn's breath went into her back. She found the place in her where the old women had put a stone and told her, "Set your feet on this when the earth tries to convince you it never loved you." She set her feet. She lifted her chin. She saw the first brass glint and heard the first command break like a stick and become two. Her voice went into her throat and waited. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." The dust plume came like a sentence someone had decided to shout after an hour of talking soft. It thickened at the bend of Basin Road, where the cottonwoods had learned to lean into wind the way old men lean into their listening. Brass caught in it, the kind of shine that announces itself because it was taught to by men who want shine to do the talking for them, and then the blue coats appeared. They were not the kind of blue that lives on a woman's skirt or in a boy's neckerchief. They were the kind that turns the air into orders. Tyenn steadied her breath. The old women had taught her how to wear breath, like a shawl in a storm. You hold it close where it warms the sternum, and you don't let the wind make a thief of it. She put a palm to Nalin's back and felt the small vertebrae carrying him through his biscuit with dignity. Rowan stood where he had chosen to stand, hands at his sides, hat brim making a neat piece of shade for the muscles along his jaw. The rider on the paint lifted nothing but attention. The soldiers split like a stream does when a rock has been there longer than the stream. Some moved toward Holt, because Holt moved toward power, the way flies move toward sweet rot. Some moved toward the yard because the yard had gathered a story, and soldiers are taught that their business is stories that don't get to gather without supervision. The one in front had a mustache that wanted to be older than the face that wore it, and eyes that didn't like being cruel, but had been taught to practice. The way his boots landed said he had not learned this land, not yet, not well. He took in the 200 in a single sweep. He took in the way they didn't take him in. He didn't let his shoulders show what his stomach rendered about that. "Morning," he said, finding the word Rowan had cleaned and trying to use it properly. "I'm Captain Harlan Ellery, United States Army. I'm authorized to—" "We don't need your authorizations yet," Holt cut in, like a child pushing his way to the front of a funeral. "You're late. I told you she'd be here." He pointed at Tyenn in the way men point at cattle on the wrong side of a fence. "That one. She cut my brand and she's running messages. She thinks she's a law unto herself." Ellery's jaw ticked once in a way that suggested he did not appreciate being used as a sheriff's errand boy, but he turned his face to Tyenn and let command set up housekeeping in his mouth anyway. "Ma'am, there have been disturbances. We've orders to interdict any couriers between bands for safety." The last word rang false in his own ear. He felt it. He didn't apologize for it. He owned he couldn't. "Interdict," Rowan repeated softly, like a man rolling a pebble across his palm to feel if it's a seed after all. "You're at my gate. Ask, Captain. Don't pretend to bless what you aim to break." Ellery's eyes flicked to him. He looked at the stacked wood. Men who notice wood stacked before a storm are not entirely lost to a better kind of logic. "Sir," he said, and the word did its job. "We'll need to search." The paint horse nickered once, and the 200 were suddenly a tighter thread around the yard without moving an inch. Tyenn could feel it, the way attention can braid itself into rope. You can tie more with rope than with hands that think every knot is a fist. "You won't search my house because a man who can't keep his calves from gates brought you a bad story," Rowan said, in the tone of someone who had sanded the edge, off anger so it could fit in a doorway. "You can ask me what you need to know and I'll answer, but you come into my rooms with hands that don't belong to this roof, and you'll learn how a beam feels when it remembers it used to be a tree." A murmur ran along the soldiers. It wasn't disrespect. It was the noise young men make when someone speaks in a way they didn't know men were allowed to. Ellery opened one hand at his side. His palm showed callus where a saber hilt trains. Your skin to behave. We're not here to tear anything apart that doesn't already want tearing, he said. It was as close to peace as a man in his clothes could offer. He looked again at Tyen. Ma'am, I'm told you carry messages. I'll need to see anything you intend to pass. Her bundle was a familiar animal against her hip. The little cylinder inside had the weight of breath and old agreement and something else too, the taste of a promise that had learned how to be a warning. She heard her grandmother in her bones. You do not show a thing to a mouth that eats names. But she also heard the new voice that had been growing under her ribs the last day, the one that had learned Rowan's kitchen and the sheriff's mouth and the rider's silence. It said, choose how to be seen. She loosened the thong. She did. It slowly, not to make a performance, but so that the act could be noticed as something other than defiance. She held the cylinder in her palm and lifted it so that the yard and the 200 and Holt's men and the blue coats and the wind could see the same thing at once. This is firewood if fire asks it, she said. This is cedar if prayer asks it. This is instructions if a headman asks it. It is also a woman who has carried something heavy across a basin with a boy on her hip and a wind in her mouth that didn't bother to tell her its name. Ellery reached, paused. Let the pause be long enough to count as permission-seeking. May I? He asked. Tyen held his eyes and let him see the answer in them. I heard you ask. I heard what kind of asking it is. She tipped the cylinder until it slid to his hand. The rider on the paint shifted his weight by the weight of a breath, and nothing else changed. Ellery didn't open it. He turned it once, twice, feeling the wrapping like a man reads braille he hasn't learned. His hands were clean in a way that didn't come from soap. The clean had been taught by discipline that kept panic from touching things it had no business touching. What does it say? Horses, Tyen said. Where they will drink, when they will not. How to meet a storm, without wasting a day trying to teach it manners. The names of plants the blue coat stepped on last week that do not forgive the stepping. She saw the corner of his mouth betray him by almost lifting and then working that smile into obedience. It says how to be a neighbor. It says we are not ghosts. It says, she added, because truths that want to live should not be offered. All at once, that Holt puts salt in water someone else drew from the ground and then calls it a gift when he lets them drink. Holt snorted, which is a sound a man's face makes when it wants to spit, and remembers that spitting used to get you slapped if you did it in front of your mother. There's the lie. She'll dress any wrong she does in lace and call it ceremony. Ellery's eyes didn't leave Tyen. Do you intend to pass this cylinder to another band? Yes, Tyen said, and there was no bruise on the truth in the saying, unless it is safer to pass what it carries and leave the wood to the fire. What it carries, Ellery repeated, aware now that the stick was not the thing. He held it up like a bartering piece and looked toward the rider with a question, in the way a man looks at a river he hopes will tell him where it's going. You know who I am, he said in that direction. Do I know who you are? The rider gave him a small courtesy. You know what I am, he said. That will do. His hand traced the outline of air, the way men who've built houses trace blueprints in dust to help explain angles to men who only think they understand nails. Ellery breathed out through his nose, a soldier's version of a shrug. You can't afford to let your shoulders perform. He lowered the cylinder and flattened his hand over it the way a man lays a letter down so that all the words in it will stop trying to fly at once. Ma'am, the order is to stop the flow of information. The order for rain? Tyen asked, and somehow there was humor sitting in the seat of her seriousness instead of robbing it. The order for birds? She tipped her head. The order for men like Holt to stop calling holes in fences opportunities? The young trooper behind Ellery laughed before he could swallow it. Ellery's eye cut sideways, and the laugh died the decent death laughter should die when trouble hasn't been born yet. But the sound had gone into the day. The day was better for it. Rowan stepped forward half a step, which is like laying a coin on a table, a small thing, but everyone knows what it means. "Captain," he said, and the word didn't scuff his tongue. "You can do 3 things here. 1, you can make my house a symbol and see if it breaks better than it holds. 2, you can take a woman away from 200 people who came here to watch their own be watched without being cut into pieces. 3, you can make your mouth dangerous to men who deserve it, and you can keep it safe for those who don't. You can go back to your post and say you watched a neighbor be a neighbor. I'll feed that story beans until it can walk by itself." The captain looked at Holt, who was attempting to make his horse agree with his expression. The horse didn't. It scratched an itch on its hock with the toe of its shoe and looked at the yard like it had known better grass. "You're on thin ice, Captain," Holt said, tone oily with the kind of confidence men get from owning more iron than sense. "Government's got clear instructions. There's pay in it for men who carry those instructions out. There's trouble for men who don't." "Trouble comes with my uniform," Ellery said dryly, and another laugh had the indecency to try to exist before it was killed. He held the cylinder back out to Tayan. "I'm not burning this on your word alone, and I won't arrest you on his. Not today." The rider on the paint took that sentence and set it where it could make shade. "We'll make space," he said, and the circle made it. They didn't move. The circle grew. Ellery nodded once. It cost him. It bought him something, too. He turned to his men. "Sergeant, we're not searching. We'll file a report. We'll—" The crack that cut him off was not a shot, and it wasn't thunder. It was a whip wrong used by a man who wanted to make a noise big enough to steal power he hadn't earned. Holt's second, a man with a straw hat that had never seen a field, snapped leather in the air and grinned at the way the paint horse's ear flicked, and the young boy in the circle jerked and then swung perfectly back to stillness because the woman beside him lifted her fingers exactly half an inch, and that was the agreed-upon sign for take your fear and set it under your seat like a lunch pail. "Holt," the rider said, not angry. A fact, a warning that had decided it didn't need to become a threat to be effective. "Your men fall all over themselves to play at thunder. It makes the sky embarrassed." Holt's smile turned to meat. "You got 200, I got 30 with rifles and a county that likes my kind of talk. I don't have to make thunder. I can make rain out of lead." Ellery's jaw hardened. "You fire 1 shot into this yard and I'll put you in irons." "You'll try," Holt said. He flicked the reins and nudged forward. His horse's eye rolled, reading the man on its back and not liking the chapter it had been given. He stopped a length from Tayan and leered to show he was learning nothing. "Girl," he said softly, "how much is your message worth when the men reading it can't protect you?" Tayan did not blink. It wasn't a trick. Her body simply refused to award him the honor of being something that made eyes forget their work. She turned her face to the man who had asked for her consent before he gave her water, who had stepped into Holt's imagine without weapons in his hands and told him not to use his own. "Rowan," she said, and in the small space that name made the world was allowed to be honest about 2 people who had decided to share a roof for a night and tried to mean that word 5 ways. "I'm here," Rowan said. She took the cylinder from Ellery. She weighed it. She weighed the way the 200 listened. She weighed the way Narlin's chest lifted, fell, lifted again. She weighed the way the wind asked for her hair as if it were a thing it had given and would like to borrow back. She turned to the trough. The water there had learned to look like a mirror in mornings, and like a mouth at noon, and like an old friend at dusk. She knelt. She held the cylinder above the trough and watched the water see it. She remembered the old woman who had told her. That some promises want to be smoke and some want to be ash, and some need to learn to be water, because water can carry what smoke broadcasts, and ash can bury. If you open it, Rowan said softly. No command in it. Only a man shoring up the edge of a thing so it doesn't fall farther than it needs to. You don't have to show what's inside to anyone who wants it to not be itself. She shook her head. I will not make the message become a spectacle to be used against itself. She lowered the cylinder into the trough like you lower the first of your dead with your hands, because shovels are for men who didn't love them. The water accepted the wood, the wrapping darkened. The first line of ink underneath thought about its life and then floated to the surface, curling like hair in steam. Holt laughed. Look at her, he crowed. Can't even commit. Won't. Wipe it clean, won't own it. That's a woman who wants to live in the middle of a road and call it a house. The rider on the paint closed his eyes once. The men at his side shifted their hands along reins in a way that said, We are not statues. We are language that knows how to be still. Ellery took one involuntary step forward. Ma'am! Tyen didn't look at him. She pushed the cylinder, deeper until her wrist was in water, and then lifted it out, dripping. Now, she said, it cannot be stolen. It can be carried. It cannot be misread. It has chosen its readers. She tipped the cylinder to Rowan. A line of wet ink ran along the wood, stubborn as a river that refused to be named. Ellery exhaled. Some of his men matched him without realizing. The yard took the breath and made it part of mourning. Your message is drowning, Holt sneered. It can swim, Tyen said, and it wasn't bravado. It was memory. The sheriff's wagon appeared then, too late to have prevented any of this, exactly on time to be required by the day. He pulled up with more kindness for his mule than his station usually had patience for. Men who do that live longer in places like this. He took in the circle and the soldiers and Holt's face that looked like a pot that had boiled all the goodness out of what it held and decided what to do with his mouth. Mr. Holt, he said mildly, you're trespassing. Holt didn't spare him a look. I'm making a point. That's not a synonym for trespassing, the sheriff said, but it thinks it is. Now. He looked at Ellery. Captain. He tipped his hat at the rider. He looked at Tyen, and then, because he was trying to be the man he wanted to, be without making a speech about being good while pie cooled on a windowsill somewhere, he tipped his hat at her too. Ma'am, Ellery's shoulders eased a degree. Sheriff, why are we all working so hard to make a day worse? The sheriff asked genially. When there's fence to mend and coffee that needs boiling. Captain, you planning to search? No, Ellery said. He sounded surprised and like someone who had just realized he meant what he was about to say. No, Holt. Holt jutted his jaw. I'm planning to reclaim my property. The sheriff smiled, and there were teeth in it, but only because he had teeth, and not because he wanted to show them to emphasize his face. If that left your mouth and had to find itself a bed, he said, it would knock on the door of a jail cell and politely ask to be let in. Leave. The deputy, a man who had not yet learned to be his own thought, and therefore leaned into the sheriff's, whether or not they were designed for sharing that day, shifted the reins and put the wagon between the soldiers and Holt without making the act obvious. Rowan's eye went to him, a small nod for a man who had remembered to do something useful with his morning dot the world held. It held long enough for a hawk to write a sentence over the yard in the alphabet only hawks will ever teach, and for a child 2 places down in the circle to make the tiny laughing sound children make when their mother lets the horse's mane touch their palm for the first time, and doesn't make a ceremony out of a small courage so that it can become a bigger one later without the child learning to depend on drums. Holt couldn't hold. Some men can't. He urged his horse closer with the heel, and the animal shifted to keep him from falling. He reached fast for the cylinder where Tyen held it out for the sun to read. Rowan moved. The rider's hand lifted. Ellery's shout was in the air, and the sheriff's hand went to his hip, because sometimes a man needs to touch the thing that will make his threat remembered, even if he does not intend to use it yet. Holt's fingers brushed the wet, and the cylinder slipped. Just enough. It slid out of Tayan's palm and hit the trough's edge. The wood made a hollow sound. The seam of the wrap caught on a splinter. The leather binding that had been softened by water gave. The cylinder cracked open into the trough, not so much. Breaking as becoming 2. Ink bled like a small creek joining a big one. The water caught the letters and taught them how to leave their skins. Words rose and unscrolled, lines lifting like snakes in early heat. The trough became a page written. By river. No one moved. And then everyone did. Holt lunged, because he had only ever learned one way to catch a thing. 2 of his men dragged their hats down and leaned, because if your teacher is a bully, you learn to help him make his arguments instead of teaching him to read. Ellery stepped forward to stop them, because even men with orders make room in themselves for the puzzle of witnessing something that has decided to be beautiful in spite of you. The rider touched 2 fingers to the air, and the 200 didn't take it as a command, because it wasn't. It was an agreement they'd made with him a long time ago, about when to become a wall and when to become a water. Tayan reached into the trough with both hands. The cold bit her skin and made her wound breathe fire along her ribs, and she did not make a sound because she wanted to hear if the day made one. She caught the floating skin of the message with her fingers and lifted. Wet paper is a stubborn thing. It wants to return to river. It wants to prove to air that it never loved it anyway. But her hands knew stubborn because they had been a woman's hands on nights when boys couldn't be comforted by logic and men couldn't be comforted by proof. She lifted what she could. She laid it on the sun-warmed board of the trough. The words glowed and began to dry and fix themselves again, different now. The way a face is different after grief redistributes its bones and decides not to leave. Holt's hand was on her wrist. He had not earned it. He would not keep it. "Enough," he hissed. "Enough of your show." The hand left. Rowan had removed it. He did it without breaking Holt and without touching Tayan beyond what her arm needed to know it was still hers. "The only show you've seen today," Rowan said, "is a woman saving a thing you want to ruin because you can't read it." Shut drew back his fist. He did not get to use it. The soldier behind Ellery had the man by the elbow before anger could lead hunger into more stupidity. "Sir," the soldier said to Holt with surprising politeness, "that's a woman." "A person," Tayan said without heat. She set one more wet ribbon of instruction on the board and watched it become legible again. "I am a person. It is a good word. It is a word that does not try to turn a hand into a rope." The rider on the paint let the silence hold the sentence, then said in English, summing it up for those who needed English to feel like they had been included, "We've seen enough." He put a little pride in it, not pride in himself. Pride in the yard, in the man, in the woman, in the 200 who had remembered how to be the shape air needed to see. "We're not done," Holt said. He was right. Men like Holt seldom. He backed his horse and looked toward the south, where dust had been a general notice and turned itself into a particular. More riders, smaller, not blue, not Holt's colors. He smiled slow. "Looks like we're about to have more company." Ellery swore under his breath like a man who reads weather from the taste of clay and realizes he set his tent in the wrong place. The sheriff steered his wagon a foot to the left for no reason that anyone could see and for every reason that mattered. The new riders came at a measured pace, the kind that told you they had learned both patience and the cost of it. There were 6. 2 wore suits that had not been cut for a saddle and were learning that it is possible to be polite to leather if you have the right teacher. 1 wore a preacher's collar. 1 wore a government agent's look before he put his papers on the table. One was a woman carrying herself like she had come because she had finished everything else that needed doing. One was a man who had nothing obvious about him at all, except the way everyone else watched his face to know when to nod. "Morning," the man said, and he borrowed Rowan's voice to do it. He tipped his hat to the rider, to Ellery, to the sheriff, to Tyan, and nodded at Rowan in a way that suggested someone had told him that the yard had grown a spine that week, and he wished to honor the doctor rather than the injury. "I'm Alden Parks." He waited for recognition. He got none. It didn't appear to offend him. "Territorial delegate," he added. "On my way to Fort Mason. Got word from town there was going to be trouble with the definition." He smiled. It wasn't a politician's smile. It wasn't a neighbor's smile either. It was the smile of a man who has decided that what he wants to say will be easier to hear if he says it, as if he just thought of it. "Definition?" Ellery asked, wary. "Of what?" "Neighbor," Parks said. "Law, trespass, order." He looked at Holt when he said, "Order," like a man looks at a stray dog who hasn't figured out that the porch is borrowed from kindness and not owed to its bark. "We heard there'd be a woman and a message, and a man who thought his brand meant he could put his name on people." Holt spat where he wanted the day to feel it. "Delegate," he said, making the word into an insult. "This is a local matter." "Everything is," Parks said pleasantly. "Unfortunately for you, I'm currently locally here." He turned to Tyen. "Ma'am, do you want me in this yard?" The old women had taught Tyen to check for the indentations in a man's words where pain had slept, and then decide if she wanted to go to sleep there too. Park's words had tired places. They were not worn out by arrogance. They were worn by carrying. She nodded once. "You may be in this yard," she said. "You may not decide for me while you are here." "Best offer I've had all week," Parks said. He took off his hat. The preacher with him swallowed a opinion and kept his hat on because his opinions had been fed too many rules and didn't know how to behave if they were allowed to be hungry in the open. "What does he want?" Parks asked the yard at large, indicating Holt with a thumb, as if Holt were an annoyance in a boot and not a man. "I mean other than to hear himself say mine, until the word gives up and enters the ground like a nail." The rider on the paint said nothing. The sheriff said, "Property, trouble, the usual." Ellery said, "Orders, because men like him are allowed sometimes to use the shortest rope to tie down the biggest truth if the longer rope is going to tangle around their feet before they get the knot done." Dot Parks nodded as if he had expected. All three answers. He looked at the 200 with a level of respect that did not feel like flattery and did not feel like fear dressed up. "All right," he said. "Right now this is a crowd and a disagreement. In an hour it could be a story we all have to tell in different rooms with different witnesses." He slid his gaze to Holt. "I didn't bring marshals. I brought paper." He lifted a hand. The woman with him passed forward a leather folder. Parks opened it and took out a document that made men like Holt feel things they don't have names for until someone gives them a gun to point at the feeling. "Affidavit," he said cheerfully. "Sheriff, you like to read before you sign?" "Sometimes," the sheriff said deadpan. "Sometimes, I guess." He swung down, took the paper, scanned it slow, letting the words set in the grooves in his mind where he kept the things that helped him sleep on nights when being good and doing his job did in fact get in a fistfight, and he had to break it. "Up, what's it say?" Holt snapped. "It says," the sheriff said, "that trespass is a word that applies to whoever walked first onto the ground that didn't invite him. It says private residence. It says lawful assembly. It says non-interference by military forces when civil authority is sufficient." He looked over the top of the paper at Ellery. "Captain, you seeing this?" Ellery nodded. "I'm seeing it." He looked almost relieved. "Orders are easier when they become letters and stop being men." "We'll stand by." He said it like a man choosing to be a shade tree instead of a lightning rod, and suspecting he might get called a coward. by someone who wanted very much to get struck instead of learn to sit. Parks turned to Holt. "You can press your claim in town," he said. "If a magistrate agrees that a living person fits in your inventory, then you win a conversation you and I will have for the rest of our lives. And if no magistrate does, you lose a little face instead of a lot of blood. That seems like a good trade." Holt's mouth did new arithmetic that his face didn't know how to keep to itself. "You think 200 will always be there when I come to collect?" he asked softly, which is how men put a different kind of iron into a sentence. "No," Parks said just as softly, and the truth of it was cold and kind at once. "I think this man," he inclined his head toward Rowan, "will be here, and I think your face will keep meeting his until one of you gets tired of what he sees there." Rowan didn't look away. Holt did, which is a small thing only to men who have never had to teach their own eyes to stand steady. The paper did its quiet work. Holt huffed. He pretended to calculate the time it would take to go to town, as if time were a servant and not a river. He threw his leg. He turned his horse. "We're not done," he said, which men like him say when they learned the power of a door by being shut out of too many. "No," the rider agreed, "but you're done for now." Holt's men made the sound of men who are about to move because the man who tells them when to move had. They dragged their hats down. They clucked. To horses. They were nearly clear of the yard's collective breath when the thing that had been waiting for a hand to give it permission to pick up the day and make it heavy finally received it. The shot came from the cottonwood line to the west, where a man no one had seen because he had bothered to be nobody all morning lay his rifle along a branch and decided to remind the basin that one man with a grudge can change the shape of a day faster than 200 with discipline can change it back. The sound cracked the world into before and after. Tyen didn't think. Her body did. It put itself between the door and the sound because Nalin was on the other side of the door, and her body is a map that draws lines around the things it calls its country. The bullet took the edge of the lintel, exactly where the horseshoe used to live. Splinters fell. The dog's bark was one note and not for long. The trough ringed like a bell. The rider's horse danced and then remembered what it had agreed to be and stilled. "Down!" Ellery barked. His men obeyed in a way that made you believe they had practiced down more than they had practiced up. The sheriff grabbed Parks by the coat and pulled him behind the wagon without ceremony. The deputy froze and then remembered how to thaw and joined him. Holt turned as if to grin to someone, and then looked surprised when he realized grinning has less power when everyone else is crouched. Rowan was at Tyen's shoulder, his body made into a wall where her wall might break. He kept his hands out, and visible and empty because of the 200 behind him. You don't make men who carry memory for a living think you are about to add one too many to the pile. "Where?" he asked, and the rider's hand flicked once. "West. You know him?" Ellery called to the rider, because men like Ellery have to turn everything into a who before they can be allowed to do anything about it. "No," the rider said. "I know the shape of the anger. It isn't ours." A second shot. It went high, too high. It cut a line through sky that sky didn't appreciate. "He's shooting to scare," Parks panted, as if looking for a reason to keep liking the day. "Or to call someone stupid. That," the sheriff said grimly, "works most of the time." He peered around the wagon. "I can make him stop if I get 10 seconds I didn't pay for." "You'll get 5, Ellery said. He signaled with his hands in a way that made the young troopers forget how young they were and remember only how precise gravity could be. When men taught it discipline, Tyen's eyes had learned to count distances when she was 17 and learned to carry her mother's last message over a creek that thought it was a river. She looked at the cottonwoods. The light there was a different shape. She swallowed and felt the raw place at the back of her throat, where songs went to rest when they'd been asked to hold too much. "He's in shade," she murmured to Rowan, because she wanted him to know the kind of thing that meant your wife might or might not come home after all. If the sun shifts, he will have to pick a branch, and men like that have an argument with choice that slows them. "Who is he shooting for?" Rowan asked. "Himself," the rider said, half to them, half to Ellery, "or for a man who wants his story to end in the middle of someone else's." He didn't look at Holt when he said it, and so the truth landed where it needed to without making the wrong man's face feel important. Third shot, lower. A crescent of dust jumped from the yard near the edge of the trough where the ink had gathered and begun to take words again. The wet lines shivered. Over the boy's biscuit there was a hand, small, serious, Narlan's. Tyen's body reacted before fear climbed up into her mouth and asked to be made into a sound. She flung her hand over his hand, and their fingers made a basket for crumbs. "And morning, I can make him stop," Ellery repeated, voice quieter now. "If I can move without starting 10 other fires, let me," Rowan said. And it was not bravado, and it was not stupidity. It was the voice of a man who knows his own yard and can read a cottonwood the way other men read Bibles. He waited until Ellery's jaw clenched in a way that admitted he knew he wasn't supposed to let a citizen, a rancher, a man without a uniform, go toward bullets. Then he waited some more until the jaw unclenched because a different rule had presented itself. Sometimes the man without a uniform is the only one the land will permit to be quick where quick needs to be. The rider on the paint moved nothing but attention. "We can cover you," he said softly into the yard's ear. "We can make our bodies be the shape of the earth you need." Rowan shook his head. "If you move, he shoots to be heard," he said. "If I move, he shoots like a man who just realized he's not as important as the ground he's lying on." He looked at Tyen. He didn't give her a speech. He didn't pretend she needed one. "Hold the door," he said. She nodded and stood so that her shoulder touched the lintel where the bullet had written its first word of the day. Rowan slid along the wall, then along the fence, then into the open in a half-crouch that would have insulted a younger man, but fit him perfectly now, because he had decided he didn't mind using any shape a day required if it got him and the people inside his roof to evening with the same names they woke up with. The yard watched him move and learned something. Holt watched and learned nothing. Ellery watched and revised a page inside himself labeled "What Civilians Do." The deputy watched and thought about whether his girl would like the way a man moved like that if she saw it. The sheriff watched and cursed because age keeps a ledger of all the times it wishes it could still move like that and charges interest. Rowan reached the cottonwoods and disappeared into the shade, the way a nail disappears into wood and you can't find it again by looking, only by knowing where it should be. The yard held its breath so hard that if breath had been a string, it would have snapped. Birds argued in the branches because birds argue. A squirrel made a choice. The man with the rifle made a different one. The sound that came out of the trees was not, in retrospect, loud. It was decisive. It was the sound canvas makes when it meets something it can't refuse and learns to be quiet again. Then the sound of metal sliding against bark very carefully, like a hand that knows it is about to be asked to do a different job than it was promised. Rowan reappeared holding a rifle by the barrel, and a man by the fear that had seeped out of him and made his joints soft. The man's hat was a lie. It said he was someone who had earned sun. His eyes were another. "You can shoot me," Rowan said conversationally, "or you can learn to say I was wrong in public." He didn't look at the yard when he said it. He didn't need to. The yard heard him because the yard had been taught to by the last day and a half. "Who paid you?" the sheriff asked, as if he were asking whether the man wanted sugar. "Or, who are you trying to impress?" The man swallowed. His throat clicked. "No one." He sounded like a calf trying to convince a gate to be open. Just someone had to say it. His eyes slid toward Holt and away again, because men who sell their sense cheap always include shame at no extra charge. Say what? Parks asked mildly, as if hoping the man would pick a better sentence than the one he was clearly about to choose. That they shouldn't be here, the man blurted. All of them. Coming in like a flood. The soldiers, He gestured, with his chin toward the 200 and tried on a word that could not quite fit in his mouth. The others. No one answered. Silence did. It put its hand on the back of the man's neck and made him feel how small men can be without being allowed to be innocent. You aimed at a woman and a child, Ellery said, and his voice was a blade put back into a scabbard slow enough for everyone to see what it could have been. You missed on purpose twice, and then forgot how to aim on purpose. That about right? The man looked like he wanted to throw up his own pride, and was trying to figure out if there was a polite place to do it. I wanted them to leave. Rowan looked at him kindly, which is different than looking at a man with sympathy. Kindness requires backbone. We are all leaving someday, he said. You trying to make it today is lazy. He looked at the sheriff. You want him. I want him to spend a night in a room where he can hear himself breathe and decide if that's who he wanted to be, the sheriff said. But first, I want him to apologize to the woman who had to put her body between his idea and her child. The man looked at Tyen. He looked wrong while looking. He looked like a boy whose apology had been beaten out of him long ago and was now a strange animal he did not know how to touch without getting bit. He couldn't lift the word. He set down a smaller one. I shouldn't have fired. Correct, Tyen said simply. You shouldn't have. She did not absolve him. She did not make him bleed for it. She turned back to the trough and the message that had decided to live as many ways as it could. Parks exhaled as if a paragraph had finally found its period. All right, he said. Captain Ellery stands by. The sheriff takes one very sorry shooter to town. Mr. Holt goes back to his very sorry fences. These 200 go where they intend, and this woman and this man and this house continue their experiment in being neighbors. He looked around. Anyone need to make a speech that will ruin that? Holt opened his mouth. The rider turned his horse so that his knee was exactly the distance from Holt that made moving past him a choice and not a compulsion. Holt closed his mouth. He turned and went, because he had calculated a position of return that did not include being knocked off his horse by a man's knee and laughed at by 200 pairs of eyes. The sheriff got his man into the wagon with the efficient compassion of someone who has lifted men who weighed more in shame than in body and refused to let it break his back. Ellery stood his men down. Parks tipped his hat to Tyen, to Rowan, to the rider, and to the dog for good measure, as if crediting everyone who had remembered not to make the day worse with the limited tools available to them. The yard breathed again. It breathed like a house exhaling after a long night of watching a child's fever and seeing sunrise come with the right color on its face. Rowan sank to sit on the step. He laid his forearms on his knees. His hands shook once, the tremor of a man who has no intention of pretending to be a rock when he is, in fact, made of the same moving materials as everyone else. Tyen sat beside him without letting their shoulders touch. Your mother would say you were decent, she said, without turning her head. She'd say I took too long to figure out how to be, he said. Then she'd feed me beans. She would be right about both things, Tyen said. She pressed the edge of the paper with the flat of her fingernail and watched the words hold. The rider eased up, the paint's shadow moving over the trough like a saved blessing. You know we didn't come as a threat, he said to Rowan. We came as a question answered. I know, Rowan said. He looked up, met the rider's gaze without flinching or trying to be more than he was. Thank you for your looking. The rider inclined his head. "You fed it," he said simply, and some of the men behind him smiled because they had been waiting to hear that a white rancher could learn to count attention as food. "What now?" Ellery asked. He'd meant it for Parks. He'd meant it. For himself. It found Tyenn's ear. "Now I go," she said softly, and Nalin heard the wind move in the word and pressed his cheek to her thigh. The message must arrive. Parks looked at the 200 and saw the thing that needed seeing. "You all aren't an escort," he observed. "You're a promise. That's different." "Both," the rider said. "A promise that walks." Rowan stood. He pulled the tarp hammock down and rolled it in a way that made it clear he intended to sleep in a bed that night, or not sleep at all. He set the little horseshoe back on the lintel without nailing it, just rested it in the scar the bullet had made and the bullet before it had threatened, as if the iron might learn to stand by, staying put on its own. He looked at Tyenn, and it was the kind of looking that can learn to be love, but knows better than to call itself that. "While smoke is still in the rafters, you can still change your mind," he said. "You can wait a day. You can let your ribs have a night without the road pressing them into new shapes." Tyenn lifted her chin. The old women moved their chairs closer inside her and nodded. "I don't love the road," she said. "But I do love what waits where this message goes." She wrapped the cylinder in the calico, the way a woman wraps an infant she will not show to anyone until he has learned to keep his own heat. She tied the string with a hair from her braid. She set her palm on the door and let the wood tell her that it remembered her and would remember her when she was gone. Rowan's hand half lifted and closed. "Then I'll walk you to the ridge," he said. "Holt won't be there until afternoon. Men like him always have to gather an audience. Might as well make the first miles in quiet." The rider's mouth did something like approval and didn't need a name. "We walk too," he said, "for a while, but not so much that you think. Our quiet is about crowding you. It is about singing without making sound." Parks mounted. He touched 2 fingers to his hat. "I'll go write something brave in a room where bravery is measured in ink and hours," he said. "I'll try to make it count." He looked at Ellery. "You can do worse than stand by. Sometimes men need to learn that standing by isn't the same as failing to stand." "I'll stand," Ellery said. And he meant both the posture and the verb that makes a man's own spine be his best uniform. They moved. They moved the way the yard asked. The 200 poured into motion like a river that had been contained by respect and now had permission to find its old banks. The soldiers shifted in a way that made clear the most important thing about them that day was not their weapons, but their willingness to let a better story be told about men in their clothes. Tyenn slung the bundle. The weight settled into that worn place above her hip where the ground and the years meet, and decide to raise a small ridge in a woman's body that is none of the world's business, unless the world has to carry what she carries, and it never does. She set her hand on Nalin's hair and felt the warmth of his scalp and the place where a child's fontanelle had once timed itself to the moon. "We are going," she told him. "We are also staying." He nodded solemnly in the way only children understand how to do, and took Rowan's finger because it was there and did not try to be a handle. They walked to the edge of the yard. Tyenn turned and looked back at the lintel. The horseshoe sat exactly where it had not been. The shadow the bullet had made a cradle for it. She thought, "Some holes agree to hold luck for a little while. If you ask them nicely, they climbed." The ridge was not steep. It was the sort of climb that reminds the spine that work is a prayer. The 200 moved like a school of fish of the desert. The sheriff rode with Ellery back toward town, and the kind of paper that keeps days like this from being misremembered into things they weren't. Parks split off north because his business was to carry words into rooms that had forgotten they were related to the sky. At the crest, the basin opened itself like a book it wanted them to read with their feet. Tyen stopped. The rider stopped. Rowan and Nalin stopped because they had reached the place where the air speaks. The man on the paint lifted his hand, and the 200 tipped their attention so that it became a roof and not a wall. "Before we go," Tyen said, "a thing." She took the 4 beans from the twist of brown paper in her bundle and set them on Rowan's palm. She had meant when she gave them for him to keep them. Now she meant for him to carry them different. "You said you feed what you can." "I do," he said. His voice was rough. The wind blamed the road for it, and not feeling, which is a kindness the wind sometimes extends to men. "Then feed this," she said, placing her other palm over his so the beans made a small, dark drum. "Feed the way this yard learned to be looked at. Feed the way the sheriff remembered to be tired in the right directions. Feed the way the soldier remembered to stand by. Feed the way the man in the suit made paper into something other than a knife. Feed the way 200 people decided not to be quiet because they were angry, but because they were listening." She lifted her hand. The beans lay there, as if they had always been meant to be there. Rowan nodded and closed his fingers. He would plant them. He would. She didn't need to know where. The knowing would happen to her anyway if she lived, and if the basin decided to send it on the wind dot. The rider turned his horse. "We go," he said, and the word had the relief of a thing that has been waiting for its chance to be necessary, and finally gets it dot. They went. The path wound between cholla that had opinions and rocks that had been there long enough to establish local customs. The 200 flowed at a distance that felt like respect and like threat both, because some kinds of respect are threats to the plans of men who think mine is a prayer dot below comma somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. A thunk sounded from the yard, the sound of iron falling on wood. Rowan looked back once and then forward again. He didn't quicken his step. The dog, who had decided to come as far as the first mesquite and then wavered, chose now to keep coming. He kept to Tyen's left so that the land remembered it had 2 sides to guard, and one of them had chosen him halfway down the ridge just as the wind shifted enough to bring them the smell of the river 5 miles off. A rider detached from the 200 and came up, not fast. He held out a hand. In it, a small roll of paper bound with thread, dyed with something purple that only grows where the hills are mean in winter. Tyen took it. She did not open it. She knew what it said. "We saw. We will carry this seeing ahead of you." She weighed it with the other thing in her bundle. She had thought, when she slept against Rowan's door, that the message was a stick and sticks are blunt. But that was the ignorance of a woman not yet a day older. Now she knew. Messages are rivers. You send them. They find their own beds. They cut stone when they must, and they carry silt for soft places. The road bent around a rocky lip and presented them with a view of the basin that reminded anyone with eyes and knees that maps are lies told by men who hate their boots. On the far side, small at first, a thin seam in the light dust rose. Not from a cattle drive, not from Holt, not from blue coats. This dust was careful. It was a long, thin line, disciplined, and it moved with the patient speed of a snake that had learned to be a river when the river dried up. Tyen's body recognized it a second before her head did. The old women inside her chairs leaned forward. The rider on the paint lifted his hand in a way that said the horse should stop and the men should keep their muscles from remembering what swinging feels like until the brain caught up. Rowan put Nalin behind his hip, and the boy obeyed because children learn fast when days write on their eyes with ink this dark dot. The dust resolved into men, not Holt's men, not soldiers, not townsfolk. They wore traveling confidence and guns that had been polished by praise. Their hats were too black for heat like this. Their horses were sleek in the way of horses that have been well fed by men who reward loyalty with oats and cruelty with more work. "Bounty," the rider said quietly. Or the kind of men who come for bounty and pretend it's about law. Tyen exhaled. She listened for the bird that had chosen to nest in her spine since morning. It fluttered once and then arranged its wings. "Who?" she asked. "No one whose name will matter after today," the rider said, "but enough rifles to make their lack of importance dangerous." Rowan squinted. He put his palm flat against Nalin's back. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the part of the air that had, over the last day, proved itself willing to carry a man's words farther than his voice would. "We should go back," he said without looking at Tyen, because he had learned in the last day that some things are easier to hear if you let the person you love stand next to you and not under your eyes while you say them. "No," Tyen said, and the word was not rebellion. It was a tool she had used every day since she had learned to carry a child and keep a fire and fetch water and argue with the land. "We go forward. The message is ahead." She touched the cylinder through the bundle. "If we turn, we invite the day to become a circle, men who love circles like the wrong kind of dance." The rider nodded. He signaled. The 200 adjusted. They did not tighten, they widened. They left space for the road to do what it would do, which was bring trouble to their feet and ask them how tired they were. The line of riders slowed. When they saw the 200, it is the privilege of some men that they believe they are the surprise in the room. Seeing that they were not surprised at all, they did the math with their mouths. The leader smirked the way a man smirks when he has spent too many nights in rooms where women are paid to pretend. Smirks are crowns. "Morning," he drawled, and turned "morning" into a bet. "You folks out for a parade?" "We're carrying a woman," the rider said. "She walks in peace. We walk peace with her." The man looked at Tyen then in the way men like him look at a woman, as a business opportunity first, then as an offense. "Heard there was a price," he said. "Government likes to reward men who help it be itself." He glanced at Ellery's general direction miles behind them with calculated contempt. "Even when the government isn't here to see." He touched 2 fingers to his hat brim with a meanness that had learned to speak politely in order to get invited to a table. "Ma'am." "No," Tyen said, and the men behind him laughed because they thought it was funny when a woman did not know how the world worked. The laugh ended when the 200 did not laugh with them. The leader shifted. Men who lean on laughter sometimes fall when it moves away. "We'll take the lady," he said. "Then you can go back to singing without making sound." He made a lazy gesture. 3 riders began to angle forward. The Paint's ears flattened. The rider's hand stayed down. The 200 did nothing that could be mistaken for drawing. The air changed anyway. Men with instincts honed by bad choices and good luck felt it and moved their horses a half-step wider without meaning to dot. Rowan stepped into the space where the road narrowed between 2 rocks. He did not spread his arms like a savior. He did not stiffen like a board. He stood like a fence post, planted by someone who meant the fence to last longer than the wind's latest monologue. "If you're here for money," he said, "go to town. Plenty of ways to pretend to be legal there. If you're here for blood, you won't like the flavor." The leader squinted as if to learn whether Rowan had the kind of eyes you could anger into closing. "You with her?" Rowan opened his mouth and then closed it because he had felt at last the shape of the word that would be true and would not make the air meaner than necessary. "Today," he said simply. He didn't look at Tyen. He didn't need to. The word had its own spine. The leader spat. He didn't have Holt's talent for it. "Today ends." He raised his hand. Guns rose in answer because guns are trained animals and sometimes they run ahead of the men who own them. "No," Tyen said again. She did not say it to him. She said it to the weather. The weather heard her. The breeze that had been flowing from the river hesitated and then reversed, just enough to throw dust in the bounty men's eyes. They cursed. Their horses blinked hard and decided that this was a poor time to forget they were prey animals, built by the world to notice shift. Before men did, they danced. They did not rear, because the 200 had been teaching them the possibility of good behavior, with silence for the last 60 seconds. Dot. The rider lifted his hand. The 200 became the shape water makes, when it understands that the rock cannot be convinced by speeches. They flowed around the edges. They didn't close. They changed what it would mean to move forward without changing where forward was. Dot. The leader realized one beat too late to make a different choice painless, that he had misread the day. He swung his rifle down, not to shoot, but to threaten. In the way men think a rifle downward is friendlier than a rifle up, he never got to point it where he meant to. A single sound cut through everything. The clatter of wood on iron from behind them, back toward the ridgeline and Rowan's yard. It echoed in a way that did not make sense to the ear, and therefore made sense to the part of a person that counts births and deaths. Rowan turned his head, not because men in front of him needed less attention, but because the sound had his. House's handwriting in it. There was another sound on top of it now, a cry. Not pain, alarm, the kind you make when a thing that should stay on a wall has learned how to fall, and you were there to witness the moment between being and being broken. The cry came again, smaller and more fierce, and it belonged to a child who had learned a new word, and it was down. Nalin's voice. Tyenn's body moved and took the rest of her with it. She stepped past Rowan, past the rider, past the long, bright barrels that were trying to be arguments. She ran for the ridge, and her lungs were a forge, and her wound was a detail, and her feet were a book of prayers. Behind her, the world lifted rifles and lifted answers and lifted names. Dot. And as she reached the crown of the rise and the yard fell open like a room you have loved all your life, she saw it. The door she had closed was open, the lintel bared like a throat, and the horseshoe she had set in the bullet scar lay split in two on the porch, iron broken clean, as if a colder hand than any of theirs had reached out and pinched luck until it couldn't hold its own shape. Dot. In the same breath. From the basin below, the bounty men shouted, and the first shot cracked toward the road. And from the yard above, someone shouted a name that was not hers and was still the worst thing she had ever heard. Dot. Everything moved at once. The sky leaned. The 200 drew silence like a blade. Rowan shouted, and his voice chose to be 10 places and none. The soldiers far behind them turned as one. The sheriff's mule brayed sullen agreement with panic. The rider threw his palm. Up into the sun. Tyenn reached for the door. The trough, warmed by morning, let the last of the ink lift from its surface and curl into the air like smoke that had learned to read. And the barrel that had been raised toward the road, and the hands that had been raised toward her house, and the day that had been raised on the back of too many men's wishes, all came down at once. And the barrel that had been raised toward the road, and the hands that had been raised toward her house, and the day that had been raised on the back of too many men's wishes, all came down at once. The first report split the air like a board, broken across a knee. Tyenn did not know from which direction it had been meant to travel. She only knew it struck the moment and set splinters flying. Her body had already chosen. Door, lintel, child. The cry that had risen from the yard had been a name that was not hers. It was Rowan's, shouted from the basin as if the ridge itself had hired a voice to carry warning up to the house. She covered the distance to the threshold with 3 strides that made her ribs ring like struck pottery. The door stood open an inch, then 2, then more, as if the day had decided it was tired of learning how to be kept out. The horseshoe she had left resting in the wound above had fallen and found a new truth at last. Iron breaks when asked to. Be luck for more weight than it can bear. 2 halves lay on the stoop, neat as a split seed. Nalin. she said, and her mouth made his name a command and a shelter at once. His small voice answered from inside with a serious calm she recognized. His father's grammar inside their child's lungs. "Down," he said, and she saw him, flat on his stomach behind the edge of the table, hands over his ears, biscuit held in his teeth so that Courage would not have to go hungry. She slid in sideways, one palm up toward the yard, as if the house were a skittish animal she would not corner. The dog, Buck, crept toward her on his elbows and put his nose under her wrist, as if he meant to push her back out. She breathed once, twice, and the pain in her side stopped lighting matches and settled to a contained glow. The room had not been invaded. There was no stranger, no shadow that did not belong, only the air's new shape around the broken iron and the echo of the shot that had cracked time outside comma below the ridge. More men shouted, their voices seeking to make the world smaller by naming parts of it theirs. The 200 gathered their silence and put it where the shouting would have to climb to reach it. Another shot. This one was a warning dressed as a dare, too high. Dust lifted from the shoulder of a boulder and drifted back down as if unimpressed. Tyen knelt. "We go together," she told Nalin, and his eyes widened and nodded at the same time. She gathered him and the halves of the horseshoe and the damp cylinder bound in calico, each object taking the place it needed along her body, as if they had discussed it beforehand and agreed to be reasonable. She stepped back into the doorway, and into the morning that had decided to learn too many languages at once. Gun, hoof, breath, command, prayer. Rowan was at the ridge, half-turned, watching both directions with the patience of a man who has been taught by fences to keep his palms open so that wire does not slice new histories into them. The rider on the paint stood in the road below, the 200 flanking in a shape that, to a man who had not learned how to read it, might look like nothing more than a casual arrangement of people and animals watching the day. The bounty men began to spread, mouths already shaping their favorite chorus. Ours, ours, ours. Tyen felt the moment trying to become a circle. She had known men who liked to dance only in circles, small ones, tight ones. They pretended it was because they loved rhythm. It was because they feared edges. She chose a line instead. "Hold," she said to Rowan without looking at him. "Let me set the first word for this part." He did not argue. His breath came once, heavy and clean, and settled. She walked down from the ridge until she stood where the rocks made the road narrow into a mouth with teeth. Nalin's fingers locked around her neck. His legs clamped her hips with the certainty of a boy who had learned that his mother was not a ship, but a coast, and thus could be trusted to stand where waves test. The bounty leader wore his smirk like a buckle that no one had dared tell him was crooked. His hat shadow made his eyes seem like pieces of iron set there to announce that he had no intention of adjusting to any light but his own. "There she is," he drawled, and Tyen watched the shape of the words in his mouth more. Then she heard them. "Folks said there'd be trouble. I see a woman and a lot of quiet." "You're used to quiet being afraid," Tyen said. "You meet a different kind today." She did not raise her voice. She did not dress it in heat. She spoke as if teaching the basin the terms it would need to recall this hour later when it was asked to testify about itself. He gestured at the riders. "Neighbors," he mocked, making the sound a man makes when he hopes another man is listening so that his cruelty might gain a second life. "Or a parade." "Memory," Tyen said. "We have brought memory. It hears better together." He huffed. "You're coming with us, memory and all." His hand drifted to the stock of his rifle like a child's finds candy in a coat pocket. "Government pays 2 months' wages to any man who helps it sleep without dreams. And how does it pay a man who wakes it?" she asked, genuinely curious. The sort of curiosity that can confuse a man who has trained himself to hear nothing but argument. "Does it thank him? Or does it pretend he did not speak and then put his name into the river as a warning?" The leader's mouth did mathematics and came up angry. That message you're carrying, I hear it's a sin, talking where talk is supposed to die. It is a message about water, she said, and horses, and where to put your feet when the weather decides it is bored with being the same for too long. She let her gaze rest on his horse's shoulder, a handsome animal, anxious at the edges, with that particular tension horses carry when they have been made too often to carry men who count cruelty as a virtue. Your horse has a better chance of understanding it than you do. A burst of coarse laughter from the men behind him, the kind that would have meant trouble on another day when his arrogance was not already being chewed by the simple fact of 200 people being unawed. By his hat, he hissed, drew up in his saddle, and raised his hand as if to bless them with gunpowder. Rowan appeared at Tyenn's shoulder. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that his breath tickled the little hairs in front of her ear when he spoke. "If he lifts that barrel any higher," he murmured, "his horse will decide to save. Face by throwing him. Let it," Tyenn said, and she felt the old women in her laugh in approval. But not yet. She shifted the calico-wrapped cylinder under her arm and reached into the bundle for the twist of brown paper. The 4 beans. She weighed them on her palm where the leader could see. "Do you know what these are?" His lip curled. "Beans. Story food," she said. "I feed the parts of this day I want to live a long time. The rest, I starve." She closed her hand. "I won't feed you." He spat at the dust, and his spit made a small, dark star that would be gone before noon. "Men," he said without taking his eyes off her, "nobody touches the parade. We just take the package." They came on in a way that betrayed their practice, the sort of practice you get by sweeping through places where law is tired and people are busy trying to earn supper. 3 men angled to cut off the road from the far side, 3 from the near, the leader moving straight as a string toward Tyenn, as if 200 had been painted on the hills, only to make his profile seem heroic. Dot. The rider on the paint lifted his hand a fraction. The 200 turned their horses' heads as one to watch the horizon, not the men. The leader blinked at that. Attention is a currency. He was used to living on its interest. Men begin to starve quickly when the eyes they expected close their mouths and listen to something else. "Last chance," Rowan said to him, polite as a man telling a calf to step aside so his hoof will not get caught in the slats. "Turn around. Nobody needs to make a day their own worst story." Now, the leader looked at Rowan fully. He found nothing he wanted to keep, so he decided to take it anyway. "You her husband?" he asked, contempt like pepper in the word. "No," Rowan said simply. "I am the man you have to move if you want to move her." He wasn't a rock. He was a fence post. He knew what he was promising and measured himself against it and did not flinch. The leader's jaw bunched. He raised his rifle. He did not fire it. He brought the barrel down, hard, intending to club a man. Men who like to make rifles into clubs tell themselves it's mercy. Really, it is vanity. They want to say later they did not shoot a man and leave out the part where they wanted to watch bone give under their hands. Rowan slipped right and forward in the same breath, the way a man learns to move who has spent years easing frightened calves out of places their bodies could not be convinced by lecture to leave. The rifle came down and met the ground where he had been. In the same motion, Rowan's hand found the leather near the leader's boot and twisted. The man yelped, surprised, and then enraged. His horse flinched. The man lurched. The rifle rang against stone. In the instant of imbalance that followed, the dog Buck shot forward, nails scrabbling, and shouldered the horse's knee. Not a bite, not a challenge. Just a reminder that the earth has advocates. The leader's seat went, the way a liar's does when the room refuses to hold his story for him. He slid, grabbed, found reins, then lost them to the horse's quick decision to take a step sideways and avoid being part of a mistake. He hit dust with a sound that made his men tense on. A small, sweet instinct. "Oh, that could be me someday." 3 rifles came level. The 200 did not answer with their own. They answered with something older. Reins lifted, horses facing outward, took 2 paces in a perfect slow arc. It brought the bounty men face to face with animals that had been taught by people who respect them that force is a thing to be reserved for snakes and cliffs. The bounty horses read, the 200 like a herd reads, water. Where to drink, how to stand, so that your reflection does not make you think there is an enemy in the trough. Captain Ellery, the rider called, voice carrying like a drawn bow. We are in lawful assembly and under civil protection. Your men standing by will remain standing. From behind, beyond the bend, there came a distant answer. The crisp yeser of command heard and accepted. The soldiers couldn't be seen, but the shape the air took when they set their rifles down on their thighs and remembered they were guardians, not predators, could. It was a better shape than the one it had carried an hour ago, and Tyen felt gratitude move through her like a very old stream freed of new silt dot. The leader scrambled crabwise and came up with a knife, proving what people always prove when their first favorite tool has been knocked from their hand, that they had other loves waiting all along. He swung it at Rowan with the strength of humiliation. Rowan's hand met his wrist with an economy that was almost tender and turned. The knife dropped, obedient to physics and to gravity's preference for men who do not insult it. Buck put one paw on the knife as if to pin a varmint dot. Another bounty man kicked his horse forward, rifle lowered in the pretend friendly way. Nalin made a small sound, a child's intake of breath that carries together fear and outrage in equal measure. Tyen felt that sound as if it were a rope around her ribs, pulling her forward and also keeping her upright. No closer, she said in a voice she had never heard come out of her mouth before, because no day had asked it to. There is a boy here. There are 200 people here who have not forgotten what certain words used to mean. There is a man beside me who believes that his mother can be proud of him. There is a captain down the road who is learning to stand correctly. There is a sheriff in town who will write this morning on a piece of paper that will embarrass you while you still have birthdays. Choose how you want to be fed in the stories other people will tell about today. The man's jaw worked. The horse under him lifted his head and blew through his nose into Tyen's palm, which she had extended without thinking, and she rubbed the soft place above his lip, and the man's weapon went a half-inch higher in confusion because his horse had taken an opinion he did not share, and that was sometimes enough to make a man check the direction of his hat. The leader had gone still. He was staring at the 2 halves of the horseshoe in Tyen's hand. "You broke your luck," he sneered weakly, which would have sounded better if it hadn't come from dust clinging to his teeth. "Should have kept that iron where it was. It didn't break," she said. "It changed. Luck is not a horseshoe. It's a room you stand in and invite the right people to share." She looked at the rider. "We are done." "We are done," the rider confirmed. "Turn back," he told the bounty men. He didn't shout. He put the words into the day the way a good mason puts stones into a wall. Set, tested, set again. Turn back, one by one, because there is a kind of dignity that reveals itself only in defeat. The bounty men did. Not all with the same grace, not all with the same speed, but they went. The leader left last, because of course he did, and he left without his knife, because the dog still had his paw on it, and it was a lesson, and men do not earn lessons by taking them back out of a dog's mouth. They stood in the quiet that comes after the best kind of fight, the kind that knows when it ends, that no one has to carry a body and no mother has to learn a new name for despair. Tyen's legs began to shake with the aftermath, and she let them, because if you deny a tremor, it returns later, bigger, the way a river makes a new path when you pretend it won't, and then comes for your house. Rowan looked at her hand. "You kept the iron," he said. "I will give it back to your lintel when it remembers how to hold," she said. "For now I will hold it." She slid the halves into a pocket where they lay heavy and honest, not pretending to be anything but what they were, something that used to be a promise, and could be again if treated with patience. They turned as Tien, Rowan, the rider, Nalin shifting to see around his mother's shoulder back toward the ridge. The 200 shifted with them, becoming a stream of attention leading uphill, instead of a ring of it holding space below. Behind them, the road resumed its old argument with distance, without anyone to insist that it was also a noose dot at the no. Crest, the yard opened. The lamp in the kitchen window had been turned down, the wick pinched tidy in a move that bore the signature of a man who hated waste and loved order enough to know which one to choose when the other made a louder case. The trough had stilled, the last curls of ink drying on the board like hair after rain. The broken horseshoe's shadow on the lintel looked like a smile someone had cut into wood, and then decided not to leave where a child could see. Tien set Nalin down. He walked very seriously to the step and picked up the smallest half of the iron. He held it with both hands the way a child holds a kitten before the kitten has decided to trust its weight to the child's arms. "For the door," he said, and looked up for confirmation. "For the door," she agreed. But not yet. The rider's people had begun to settle their horses, the patience of long miles returning to their hands now that the morning's teeth had been blunted. A woman with a braid like a rope made of night water brought Tien a strip of dried meat and a canteen. Tien took both and thanked her with her eyes, and with the angle of her chin, and with the relief that showed briefly on her face before she pulled it back, not out of pride, but to keep it from becoming a burden anyone else would feel obliged to carry. "Now we go," she said. She looked to the rider, and he merely lifted a shoulder. The day answered in any direction. He pointed. Rowan took one step toward the trough, and without looking anyone in the eye, lifted the damp sheet that had been the skin of the message, and checked that the words had chosen to remain where she had coaxed them to. They had. They were legible in a new way, as if something in the act of water and drying had taught them to speak differently when needed. He set the sheet back as carefully as if it were a sleeping animal. "Let me walk with you a while," he said. "You said the ridge," Tien replied, and it was not a correction, only a measuring of promises. "I said a ridge," he said, and smiled a little at the stubbornness they had begun to share. "There are many. I have learned to expand my definitions." He whistled soft. 4 notes only the dog would hear, and Buck ambled over and leaned his whole side against Rowan's leg as if to say, "We learned a new way to stand today. Let's practice it." They set out again. The 200 did not escort in a way a white man would call an escort in a book. They did not ride ahead with banners. They did not ride behind with drums. They glided to either side at a distance that let the land keep its secrets, and yet ensured that any new man with a rifle would have to deal first with people who had already decided not to fear his kind of talking. The basin gave up its secrets slowly, a path around a bluff that wasn't on any map, because the mapmakers had not loved their boots enough. A seep where the rock's heart broke into water just long enough for a bird to decide the day was worth singing. A cloud that threatened and then reconsidered, flinching and flying toward the hills like a deer that had seen a boy raise his arm, and had not waited to see if it held a stone. Tien walked with her back straight, and her mind leaned slightly forward, the way a woman does when she's guiding the hour by the hand, but wants the hour to think it discovered the path itself. She thought of the message and of the people to whom it was going, faces she knew, a few she had not yet met, all of them threaded, as she was, to a long, quiet, bright as a blade, smithed long before anyone owned iron. She thought of the men in blue, and the way Captain Ellery had learned to let his shoulders say yes to the right person. She thought of the sheriff and of Alden Parks, and of the way paper can be a weapon and a pillow both. And she thought of Holt, and the way some men are lost to themselves long before anyone else has a chance to find them. at a stand of cottonwoods, that had found a way to live where no water seemed visibly to agree with them. The rider lifted his hand, and the 200 became smaller without becoming fewer. Tyann felt the old pull in her bones toward a certain kind of clearing that had held certain kinds of words for many winters. The sign was there, not large, not meant for everyone. 3 stones stacked, the middle one chipped on purpose, the top one rubbed with the last of last spring's ochre. She breathed out. Here. They entered in a way that does not appear as entering to men who think arriving is something the earth must always notice. The clearing held patience. Several people were already there. Tyann recognized 2 at once. Ayehe, who had once taught her to put a hand on her belly and tell the storm where it was allowed to move, and Ndé, who had made jokes so dry that laughter had not dared gather around them for fear it would catch fire. Ayehe's eyes took in Tyann's face and went at once to the bundle and the bandage and the set of her mouth. Then she reached for Nalin and did what grandmothers who are grandmothers in more ways than blood know how to do. Kissed him on the top of his skull in a way that told his bones where to keep growing in case the world had not given them a map. Nalin sighed and became, briefly, wonderfully, only a child. And they looked at Rowan and let each of his features be counted, and then returned without adding or subtracting. "This one stands," he observed, and it had the shape of approval, and of a question that had already been answered. "He stands," Tyann said, "and he listens." The clearing did not ask her to perform. That had been done for too many white men's tastes lately. It invited her to place. She set the calico and the cylinder and the damp skin of words on a flat stone, warmed by sun. Ayehe poured a little water into the hollow in the center, and the words brightened, as if water were a story they wanted to hear again before they continued their journey. She spoke, then, not an oration, a direction. It included the horses' paths and the places soldiers were learning to stand. It included Holt's men and the shape of their anger and the way that shape had dented at the edge where it had met 200 eyes. It included the bounty men and the way a dog's paw on a knife could be a lesson later repeated in rooms where knives were never supposed to be seen because people there lived under the impression that knives only belonged to men who didn't wear collars. It included Rowan's yard, not as a sanctuary, a word white men sometimes insisted on giving things because it made them feel holy and therefore excused from the daily work sanctuary requires, but as a place that had chosen to be a roof and a fence and a table, and had not asked to be paid for it in anything but attention and continued decency. She did not adorn him. She did not sell him. She set the fact of him on the stone and let it sit there among the other facts until the whole arrangement began to glow with that ordinary grace that is the only kind people can carry very far without. Spilling. When she had done, Ayehe lifted the skin of the message again and tilted it so that the light went through. The water caught the letters and returned them to the rock. "It is enough," she said. "It is also not finished. Perhaps it will never be finished." She looked at Tyann, and the look became a smile, and then something older. "Your grandmother was right about you," she added. "She said you would. Learn how to carry more than one thing and still name each weight, so you would not hate any of them." Tyann's throat closed and opened with love, and something else that had been living under her sternum since the ravine, and the cough, and the burning and the quiet. Grief that did not ask for a cry, only for a place to sit. She let it sit. She did not feed it beans. She poured it a little water and told it was welcome in the clearing, and that it would be asked to move on when they were done. Ndé motioned toward Rowan with his chin. "You will go back with him," he said. It was not a question. He will need eyes that have learned to see as yours do. The way he has been looked at today will attract more looking, some of it honest, some of it hungry. "I will go," she said, "not to make his yard into anything it is not, to help it remember itself when men arrive who would like to force it to forget." She touched the pocket where the iron lay, and to put his luck back where it belongs, when it is ready for it. Ayehe stepped close. She smelled of sage and of the kind of smoke that does not enter hair. It only tells hair a secret as it passes. "He is not a husband," she said, quietly, so that she and Tayen and no one else could hear it. "He is a place. We marry places too, sometimes, if we are smart." Tayen smiled, and it felt like braiding. Old things, new thread dot. They did not linger. The 200 did not let the clearing think it had turned into a fort. They took the words, not the paper. They took the direction, not the authority. They whistled to the wind in the particular tone that makes beings without saddles look up and pay a new kind of respect to beings with them. They left, some north, some northeast, some in the direction that was not a compass point, but a promise. Tayen, Rowan, Narlin, and the rider turned back toward the ridge. The sun had slid along, the sky without hurrying, and the hours felt like they had been useful. The basin had that look it gets in mid-afternoon, when it is deciding whether to offer a breeze or pretend it does not remember how dot. They reached the yard not long after the mule prints had cooled. The sheriff's wagon had gone. The soldiers. Dust had resolved into a soft haze over the far hills. On Rowan's table lay a folded paper with Park's handwriting. Tayen recognized it, even without having seen him write before. It was the kind of hand that made letters into people and people into letters. "Thank you for the hospitality you did not advertise. I will try to earn it where men pretend to." A.P. Ellery had left a different note, the soldier in him obedient, even when he was learning to change uniforms inside his mind. Standing by. "No searches without cause. I will sign that with my own name in town. God help me if my superiors ask me to rewrite it." H.E. Rowan read both and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he set the notes under a small, smooth stone that Nalin had collected. Earnest children collect stones the way some men collect sins, and went to the lintel. He touched the scar. He weighed the halves of the horseshoe. He shook his head. "Not yet," he echoed. "Maybe not as it was." He set the halves on the table and took out a small forge he had made from a box and a bellows and stubbornness. The rider watched with interest, his head cocked like a man who recognizes craft even when it is not his own. Rowan lit the coals. The bellows sighed. Iron glowed. He did not hammer. He bent. Slowly, with tongs and care, he coaxed the halves toward each other, not into a circle, not into the old U that white men claimed caught luck like rain. He formed them into a gentle open arc, each end pointing down like arms lowered after a long, hard morning, an invitation, not a trap dot. He let it cool and hung it above the door on 2 nails left slightly proud so that the iron could be lifted down easily if someone needed to carry the luck somewhere else for a while without asking. A wall's permission. He stepped back. The rider made a sound that could have been approval and could have been recognition of a particularly good piece of topography. "Feed," Tayen said softly, and he nodded. They went to the edge of the yard where a shallow patch had been a dream. Of a garden for 2 years Rowan had planted, and nothing had grown there but the indecision of a man who tends everything but his own wanting. She placed the beans in his palm again. "Now," she said, "use today's water." They planted together, Nalin patting earth in a serious way that promised friendship with the ground, if the ground would agree to such a thing without charging too much. The dog lay with his chin in the dirt, watching the work as if it were a show made for him alone. When it was done, the light had softened, and the wind had remembered how to be kind without first being cruel. The rider and the last few of his people who had lingered near the yard turned their horses. "We will be in the basin," he said. "Close enough to listen, far enough not to make your roof think it has been drafted into a fort." Tayen took his hand. It was the only time she had touched him. It felt like bark on a tree that had learned to bend without breaking. "Thank you," she said. for letting me be seen without making me turn into your story." He smiled in a way that belonged to a boy who had been taught by a woman to be patient with his strength. "You made your own," he said. "We only made sure the wind didn't steal it." They went. The yard settled into the evening. Rowan made beans. It was what he did when answers needed to eat, before they were asked any more questions. He stirred, with a spoon that had worn his thumb smooth. Tyen sat at the table where she had first given her son water, and the room had first asked her if she wanted to belong. She held the calico-wrapped cylinder one last time, and then eased the skin of words flat and read again the lines that needed to be carried now in memory, because paper will always betray you to fire at some point, and memory, if fed, will not dot Nalin. Climbed into her lap and fell asleep with the astonishing speed of children who trust the room to keep being a room even when they are not looking at it. She kissed the spot on his head, where Aye's blessing still warmed, and found, to her own small surprise, that she was not thinking about whether a man would be outside the door when she laid him down. She was thinking about whether she had added enough salt to her own body today to match the day's sweat dot. The beans were done. Rowan set bowls and bread and the little bit of sweetness he kept for days when sweetness did not come on its own. They ate the way people do who have earned the right to do something so basic well. No speech, no vows. They included the dog in the meal, because men who feed dogs in front of women are telling one of the truest stories they can about how they intend to treat beings weaker than themselves when no one is keeping score. After Rowan washed the bowls, and Tyen dried them and put them on the shelf where the lopsided son of plates lived. He looked at her and did that thing he had learned to: ask without making words, do all the work. "You will sleep," he said, "and in the morning?" "In the morning," she said, "I will walk. There is more carrying to do." She thought of the clearing. She thought of Park's thin paper in town. She thought of Ellery's shaky stand. She thought of Holt's face learning a new math with another man's knee for a blackboard. "I can walk with you to the next ridge," he offered again, "or the one after. You do not have to keep offering," she said gently. "I know it is there. That is enough to feed me when the road tastes like dust and meat." He nodded. He did not press. He looked at Nalin asleep and felt something like a hand on his chest that was not a hand, and would not be until or unless the world had finished asking the two of them to be other things first. "If you ever bring him back here," he said, "the bed will remember him." "The bed remembers him already," she said. And for a moment they were two people allowed to say such a thing because the day had been heavy enough to earn them. A small ease. Later, when the lamp was out and the night had chosen to be friendly, she sat with her back against the door again. Rowan had hung his new luck above her head. It felt right, like a sentence that had learned where its verb should. Sit. She listened to the yard breathe and to the dog shift and to the small sounds men make in sleep when they have done the best they could with the day. Her ribs ached. She pressed a palm there and spoke to the ache the way a woman does when she knows she will need to be friends with it for longer than she would like. "You can stay," she told it, "but you do not lead." It agreed, because pain, if respected, does not always try to be a sovereign. Dawn came like a thought the room had been working toward all night. She rose, wrapped Nalin, tightened the bundle, adjusted the strap so it lay where it should. Rowan made coffee, less of a fist, more of a handshake. He poured it into the cracked cup and set it in her hand without saying that he had tried to make it gentle, because he knew gentleness has its own danger. You come to count on it, and then the road takes it away, and you resent the road. When the road was never built with gentleness in mind. They ate bread. They said nothing unnecessary. At the door, he put his palm flat to the lintel. She put hers next to it. For a second, They were two people promising to remember a piece of wood, and that felt like a more holy vow than anything either of them had ever heard in a building made for vows. They stepped into the morning. The rider was there, not at the gate, not in the yard, not making themselves anyone's horizon. He tipped his chin. It held the information of 100 yeses and 1 no for anyone who had been taught to read. Tayan walked. She did not look back beyond the last glance you give a room that has offered you a version of yourself you had not yet met. She felt Rowan's eyes become part of the air behind her, and then felt them return to the house where they belonged. She set her feet to the line the day gave her and told the message inside her ribcage. We are water. We go where we are needed. We do not apologize for being stronger than stone sometimes. At the ridge she paused. The basin spread itself again. A hawk drew a new sentence. Far to the south, a point of dust declared that men like Holt woke angry, no matter what lessons had been tried on them. She adjusted Nalin on her hip. He stirred and mumbled in his small grammar. Beans, he said, a prayer and a statement of fact and a promise. Yes, she said. Beans. She went on. The 200, as before, did not announce that they moved. They were the weather that remembers who to forgive. The path ran alongside a low arroyo, where stones told old gossip, and small green things had learned how to keep water like a secret. They met a trio of men, who might have been traders, and might have been thieves, and decided not to be either when they saw who travelled with her. They met a woman driving 2 goats. Her eyes were loud with the news that her husband was sick, and the town's doctor had charged her twice and told her to pray. Tayan gave her a piece of bread and a direction that included a clearing with 3 stones, a chipped middle, and a top rubbed with ochre. They will help you carry, she said, and they will charge you nothing you cannot afford. Chatterjee, woman cried, without making the air owe her any more than it already did, and went on with goats who admired her for remembering which shrubs didn't bite. They met toward noon, a soldier alone, leading his horse, saddle off, a stone bruise on. The animal's back from ill-fitting tack. He looked at Tayan, saw 200 people he did not know what to call, saw the rider on the paint, put it together, and decided to have a different kind of day than the one he had started out having. Ma'am, he said. The rider gave him a water skin. Tayan told him where the arroyo widened and where to stand in it to catch the shade at the right time. He tried to hand back the skin. The rider shook his head. The soldier nodded, slowly, as if his neck had carried too many orders the wrong direction and was trying to learn a new street. By late day, the earth opened again and offered the hint of a path she had not seen before, a path that went where the message went next, a little left, a little deeper into the part of the basin where earth loved trees enough to not gossip about them when they weren't green. She paused. She looked to the rider and found him already looking at her. Here, she said, this is where we part today. This is where we will be near without being here, he replied. She put her palm flat to the air between them, a gesture that had learned to be prayer and never once decided that it therefore had to stop being useful. He extended his own. They did not touch. They met the air. They bowed to what the day had done and to what it had refused to do. She turned then and went on. The light thinned. The ground softened under Nalin's footfalls where he walked now, earnest in the way. Boys are when they realize their steps can contribute to a day. She taught him a word for a bird, and the bird flew up and accepted it. She taught him the word for iron, and he said it wrong, and it was better that way because it tasted less like men who think walls owe them. When the first camp smoke found their noses, she smiled. It was the kind of smoke that tells your ears what. The night will sound like long before it sets your shoulders at ease. She entered the camp with the same respectful ordinary with which she had entered Rowan's kitchen and Ayehe's clearing and the sheriff's unsteady kindness. She took the weight of herself and the message and set them down together. It was evening before she thought again of Rowan's face. She let it come. She let it go. She felt the open-armed iron above the door and knew that houses can hold people even when they're not inside them, if those people have agreed to build something bigger than sleep. The night moved around her. She did not have to sit at a door. There were other doors. Other women sat. There were other children. Nalin played with a stick and decided it was a horse, and then a river, and then a snake, and then a rope, and finally a spoon. He fed a shadow and told it was lucky. She lay down. She slept. The dream that came was not a bad one. It was a lesson and a laugh, and a long view all braided together. A road that went past a yard where beans sprouted in the exact shape of 4 small truths, and a dog insisted a man throw a stick that was in fact a knife. And the man laughed and threw it anyway, and the knife learned finally what it was. For morning came again, as it will, until it doesn't. She rose. She carried. She delivered. She rested where rest would make work smarter. She watched the 200 turn into 100 where 100 would do, and into 10 where 10 could listen better, and into 2 in a place where 2 sets of eyes were less likely to scare a woman whose door did not know how to hold that much attention at once. Days later, but not jumped, only walked in proper sequence. She stood again at Rowan's yard, with Nalin's hand in hers, and dust on her neck, and the feeling at the hinge of her jaw that meant she had smiled more than once without meaning to. The beans had sprouted. Tiny, winding green. The iron above the door had not fallen. The dog brought her a stick that was not a knife, and she threw it and he returned it, and they had invented a new kind of treaty that felt like friendship. Rowan opened the door. His eyes asked, and she answered by stepping in and setting her bundle down, as if it were now a part of the room that had always been there, only previously mislaid. He poured coffee. It did not punch. It did not plead. It kissed the morning and moved it along. "Did you deliver it?" he asked at last, because questions should be set on the table like bread, not flung across it like accusations. "I delivered it where it needed to go," she said, "and it delivered me back." He nodded. He looked at the beans through the window and back at her, and then he did something that made a new room in her chest open. He did not make a speech about fate or about the land or about the way men sometimes like to imagine that a woman's path becomes part of their path automatically if she happens to pass by their gate more than twice. He said simply, "Stay as long as you need, and when you need to go, tell me where to send any man who comes looking for trouble with your name in his mouth." She put her palm on the table. He put his on the wood a hand's breadth away. The space between them was not empty. It was field. It would grow what it needed to grow. And if one day it grew a path, they would walk it. And if it grew only beans and a dog's insistence on being loved, that would be harvest enough for 2 people who had learned that luck is an arc, not a circle. And that memory is a wall you build with other people's hands and let them live behind it with you. Outside, the wind turned and remembered the smell of creosote it had carried the day she arrived. It brought it again, and this time it smelled. Less like dust and more like rain, that might mean to come after all. She went to the lintel. She touched the iron. "You learned," she told it. The iron said nothing, being iron, but the house felt different under it, as if roofs can smile. "When no one is looking," she turned to the basin. "We go again," she told Nalin. He pointed at the sprout. "Later," he decreed in legislation, "toddlers have been passing since the first mother tried to get the day started, before a boy's curiosity was done with the item in front of him." She laughed, and the laugh belonged to her. It did not borrow anything. It did not need to be an argument or a defense. It was simply the sound a woman makes when the road and a house and a message have all chosen to keep her company instead of taking her away from herself. And somewhere beyond the ridge, 200 people rode in a long, slow line that did not frighten cattle and did not teach children anything, but the fact that attention can be a softer blanket than fear. The day went on. They worked. They ate. They listened. They let the wind borrow their names and return them improved. Holt passed the edge of the basin and looked in and saw that he could not own the air and kept riding toward a place where men would lie to him better. Ellery wrote something honest and was not fired for it. Parks made the paper forget how to be a knife for one afternoon. The sheriff baked a pie and then ate it with his deputy and taught him what a real apology sounds like when it is not being forced into a man's mouth with a fist. Tyen carried again. She rested again. She told the old women inside her that their chairs were still needed, but that they could put their feet up for an hour. She would fetch the water and pour it for them. They laughed so hard the tent walls shook behind her eyes. If you had stood on the hill above Rowan's yard at sunset and asked the land to tell you what it saw, it would have said, a woman and a man and a boy and a dog and a row of beans and a piece of iron that has learned how to invite luck without trying to imprison it. It would have said a road and not just one. It would have said a message running like water where water is wanted. It would have said enough. Two more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Where stones told old gossip and small green things had learned how to keep water like a secret. They met a trio of men who might have been traders and might have been thieves and decided not to be either when they saw who traveled with her. They met a woman driving 2 goats. Her eyes were loud with the news that her husband was sick and the town's doctor had charged her twice and told her to pray. Tyen gave her a piece of bread and a direction that included a clearing with 3 stones, a chipped middle, and a top rubbed with ochre. They will help you carry, she said, and they will charge you nothing you cannot afford. Chatterjee, woman cried, without making the air owe her any more than it already did, and went on with goats who admired her for remembering which shrubs didn't bite. They met toward noon, a soldier alone, leading his horse, saddle off, a stone bruise on. The animal's back from ill-fitting tack. He looked at Tyen, saw 200 people he did not know what to call, saw the rider on the paint, put it together, and decided to have a different kind of day than the one he had started out having. "Ma'am," he said. The rider gave him a water skin. Tyen told him where the arroyo widened and where to stand in it to catch the shade at the right time. He tried to hand back the skin. The rider shook his head. The soldier nodded, slowly as if his neck had carried too many orders the wrong direction and was trying to learn a new street. By late day, the earth opened again and offered the hint of a path she had not seen before, a path that went where the message went next, a little left, a little deeper into the part of the basin where earth loved trees enough to not gossip about them when they weren't green. She paused. She looked to the rider and found him already looking at her. "Here," she said, "this is where we part today." "This is where we will be near without being here," he replied. She put her palm flat to the air between them, a gesture that had learned to be prayer and never once decided that it therefore had to stop being useful. He extended his own. They did not touch. They met the air. They bowed to what the day had done and to what it had refused to do. She turned then and went on. The light thinned. The ground softened under Narlin's footfalls where he walked now, earnest in the way. Boys are when they realize their steps can contribute to a day. She taught him a word for a bird, and the bird flew up and accepted it. She taught him the word for iron, and he said it wrong, and it was better that way because it tasted less like men who think walls owe them. When the first camp smoke found their noses, she smiled. It was the kind of smoke that tells your ears what. The night will sound like long before it sets your shoulders at ease. She entered the camp with the same respectful ordinary with which she had entered Rowan's kitchen, and Ayehe's clearing and the sheriff's unsteady kindness. She took the weight of herself and the message and set them down together. It was evening before she thought again of Rowan's face. She let it come, she let it go. She felt the open-armed iron above the door and knew that houses can hold people even when they're not inside them, if those people have agreed to build something bigger than sleep. The night moved around her. She did not have to sit at a door. There were other doors, other women sat, there were other children. Nalin played with a stick and decided it was a horse, and then a river, and then a snake, and then a rope, and finally a spoon. He fed a shadow, and told it was lucky. She lay down. She slept. The dream that came was not a bad one. It was a lesson and a laugh, and a long view all braided together. A road that went past a yard where beans sprouted in the exact shape of 4 small truths, and a dog insisted a man throw a stick that was in fact a knife. And the man laughed and threw it anyway, and the knife learned finally what it was. For morning came again, as it will, until it doesn't. She rose. She carried. She delivered. She rested where rest would make work smarter. She watched the 200 turn into 100 where 100 would do, and into 10 where 10 could listen better, and into 2 in a place where 2 sets of eyes were less likely to scare a woman whose door did not know how to hold that much attention at once. Days later, but not jumped, only walked in proper sequence. She stood again at Rowan's yard, with Nalin's hand in hers, and dust on her neck, and the feeling at the hinge of her jaw that meant she had smiled more than once without meaning to. The beans had sprouted. Tiny, winding green. The iron above the door had not fallen. The dog brought her a stick that was not a knife, and she threw it and he returned it, and they had invented a new kind of treaty that felt like friendship. Rowan opened the door. His eyes asked, and she answered by stepping in and setting her bundle down, as if it were now a part of the room that had always been there, only previously mislaid. He poured coffee. It did not punch. It did not plead. It kissed the morning and moved it along. "Did you deliver it?" he asked at last, because questions should be set on the table like bread, not flung across it like accusations. "I delivered it where it needed to go," she said, "and it delivered me back." He nodded. He looked at the beans through the window and back at her, and then he did something that made a new room in her chest open. He did not make a speech about fate or about the land or about the way men sometimes like to imagine that a woman's path becomes part of their path automatically if she happens to pass by their gate more than twice. He said simply, "Stay as long as you need, and when you need to go, tell me where to send any man who comes looking for trouble with your name in his mouth." She put her palm on the table. He put his on the wood a hand's breadth away. The space between them was not empty. It was field. It would grow what it needed to grow. And if one day it grew a path, they would walk it. And if it grew only beans and a dog's insistence on being loved, that would be harvest enough for 2 people who had learned that luck is an arc, not a circle. And that memory is a wall you build with other people's hands and let them live behind it with you. Outside, the wind turned and remembered the smell of creosote it had carried the day she arrived. It brought it again, and this time it smelled. Less like dust and more like rain, that might mean to come after all. She went to the lintel. She touched the iron. "You learned," she told it. The iron said nothing, being iron, but the house felt different under it, as if roofs can smile. "When no one is looking," she turned to the basin. "We go again," she told Nalin. He pointed at the sprout. "Later," he decreed in legislation, "toddlers have been passing since the first mother tried to get the day started, before a boy's curiosity was done with the item in front of him." She laughed, and the laugh belonged to her. It did not borrow anything. It did not need to be an argument or a defense. It was simply the sound a woman makes when the road and a house and a message have all chosen to keep her company instead of taking her away from herself. And somewhere beyond the ridge, 200 people rode in a long, slow line that did not frighten cattle and did not teach children anything but the fact that attention can be a softer blanket than fear. The day went on. They worked. They ate. They listened. They let the wind borrow their names and return them improved. Holt passed the edge of the basin and looked in and saw that he could not own the air and kept riding toward a place where men would lie to him better. Ellery wrote something honest and was not fired for it. Parks made the paper forget how to be a knife for one afternoon. The sheriff baked a pie and then ate it with his deputy and taught him what a real apology sounds like when it is not being forced into a man's mouth with a fist. Tyen carried again. She rested again. She told the old women inside her that their chairs were still needed, but that they could put their feet up for an hour. She would fetch the water and pour it for them. They laughed so hard the tent walls shook behind her eyes. If you had stood on the hill above Rowan's yard at sunset and asked the land to tell you what it saw, it would have said, a woman and a man and a boy and a dog and a row of beans and a piece of iron that has learned how to invite luck without trying to imprison it. It would have said a road and not just one. It would have said a message running like water where water is wanted. It would have said enough. Two more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.